Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horse Boy and The Long Ride Home. Before I jump in with today's guest, I want to say a huge thank you to you, our audience, for helping to make this happen. I have a request. If you like what we do here, please give it a thumbs up, like, subscribe, tell a friend. It really, really helps us to make the progress. To find out about our certification courses, online video libraries, books, and other courses, please go to rupertisaacson.com. So now let's jump in. Welcome back to Live Free, Ride Free. Self-actualization comes in many forms. Following your passions, following your interests, following your obsessions, nerding out and being able to eventually make that one's profession is, I think, something that we all regard. Been following this man, Justin Sledge, for quite a while on YouTube, and I urge you, in fact I could make a little pun and I could say I demi-urge you, which he will explain what that pun is, to follow him too. He has a YouTube channel called Esoterica. The esoteric, the arcane, the mythological, the occult, but looked at through the lens of a scholar while being pretty entertaining. I can't resist that stuff. Ex-adjunct professor of philosophy and religion at Wayne State University. Now full-time sharer of the esoteric muse with the rest of us. Dr. Sledge, what an honor to have you on. Please, can you give us a bit of an idea about who you are and what you do and why you do it?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, my name is Justin Sledge. I'm a full-time public educator on topics in the study of Western esotericism. So I study esotericism, which, as you mentioned, is things like the occult and alchemy and Kabbalah and magic, but studying those through an academic lens. Not that the academic lens is the only or even maybe even the best way of studying them, but it's certainly one of them, and it has its own set of rigors, which are useful. But yeah, I study this material and I do public education on my YouTube channel. I also teach in the university here locally in the philosophy and religion department, but mostly transitioned to being a full-time public educator. You know, I think any educator, if you could say, look, if you could reach an audience of 30 students, that's pretty impressive. What if you can reach an audience of 30,000 students? And so I think most educators want to do something like that. And so I've been very blessed and very lucky to have built up a pretty substantial audience on my YouTube channel, and that's basically what I focus most of my time on, though I've done some publishing and recently returned from Egypt, where I did some tours and seminars there, and so really building out kind of a educational system, one might say, for really making this information, which historically is quite difficult to access and even difficult to access now, but making that much easier for people to access for whatever reasons they choose to study it.
Right. History and philosophy, most people just going to leave the room immediately, and that I never understood, because I always loved it because I'm a massive nerd, until I actually had to study it at school. And then I thought, Jesus, these guys suck all the life out of it. I absolutely understand now why everybody hates it, because it's presented not as it should be, which is as a sort of a Game of Thrones-esque sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the past, allowing us to understand the states, which never did anyone any good. You managed to present history and philosophy and make it feel like you're sort of in the room with the guys. So for the listeners, I want you to imagine things like questions you might have had about witchcraft, questions you might have had about the Salem witch trials, questions you might have had about Kabbalah, these words that you hear, questions that you might have had about angels and demonology and the Seal of Solomon. And Justin Sledge is going to tell you all about them.
Something about them.
A lot more than a lot of others.
Perhaps, yeah.
What prompted you to do this? Take us back to when you were a boy. You grew up in Mississippi, which is not known necessarily as one of the great seats of Western esotericism. Well, maybe it is because of Ole Miss and the Greek revival thing of the Old South. I don't know. But, we tend to think of Mississippi as a state sort of defined by racism and things like that. So you're down there and somehow you get interested in all this and you now make your career in it. Tell us the story. How did it all happen?
Yeah, I've gotten asked this question a lot, and the more that I think about it, the more the question, the more I think about it, the more the answer becomes more and more complex because I think more and more about my own childhood. It must have been several redundant things. Mississippi as a place is kind of a pressure cooker, and which is to say that if you're not going to conform, you have to not conform all the way because the social pressures are so severe that you have to really achieve an enormous escape velocity if you're going to be unique in any specific way. And you can see this in the kind of writers that we produce. We think people like Eudora Welty or William Faulkner.
Yeah.
So it produces people like that. Not to compare myself in any way to those great titans, but I think that I grew up watching a lot of the shows that I think a lot of people in my generation watch, with sort of Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World and In Search of with Leonard Nimoy, and these are shows that are unsolved mysteries. Robert Stack, Walking Out of the Fog, and it would be these sort of shows that highlight unusual aspects about history, things like Atlantis, or ghosts, or Sasquatch, or the Bermuda Triangle, or something like that. And those kinds of shows just fascinated me because they basically told me that the world was much weirder than I thought it was. And I just, it was a kind of thing where I couldn't let it go. It was just interesting whether or not they really were ghosts or they really were UFOs or what have you. And I think what ended up happening was that I maintained a deep interest in that material, but I also became pretty skeptical of it. I began to think to myself, all right, if there is a Loch Ness monster and that Loch Ness monster doesn't have magical properties and it's just an animal, then it has to be able to eat. So how much fish would need to be in the Loch Ness for a family of Loch Ness monsters to be able to survive? And you start doing some math.
Haggis. They eat haggis.
They eat haggis, yeah. So of course they come on shore and they drink scotch too.
They do.
Lefroy and Lagavulin were the Loch Ness monster.
That's on the western end of the loch. On the eastern end, they drink the space sides. Yeah,
exactly right. Yeah, it all depends on where they are.
Yeah.
And so these kind of questions is vampires, right? Like if we're interested in vampires, and I'm like, all right, well if there is a vampire and they bite one person and they don't turn them into that person becomes a vampire, how long until the world becomes all vampires? And the questions just like vexed me, right? And it became the case where the
How old are you at this
skepticism.
point, getting vexed by vampires?
Oh, I must have been in middle school.
Okay.
In fact, it must have maybe even earlier than that, because I distinctly remember being in 5th grade and thinking that a girl in the 6th grade was in fact a vampire and becoming very terrified of her. She had this very bright, vibrant red hair, and for whatever reason, I was convinced. And I remember the moment where I was like talking to a friend in hushed tones. I'm like, I think she's a vampire, and she looked over at me with like these glaring eyes and smiled at me. And of course, 5th grade me didn't think, oh, that's a girl smiling at you. That's the beginning of like flirting. 5th grade me was like, oh God, she's a vampire and she can read my thoughts and she knows that I know that it's over. Like I'm dead.
But what could be more compellingly attractive? I hope you immediately became her loyal slave.
One would hope, but I don't know if you know what happened with her. I should look her up and see if she's still a vampire. She looks exactly the same. She's still 12 years old. But yeah, so these kinds of things just fascinated me. And I think that typically people go one of two ways. They sort of grow up and become a skeptic in the most boring sense of that word. Their world becomes completely disenchanted, and they live a life of slavish adherence to a fundamentally disenchanted world.
Joylessness.
Joylessness, but also a kind of like very boring, incorrect version of like 18th century mechanicalism or something like that. Or they become sort of the other side of it, where you become convinced that basically every unusual thing is real. It's sort of what I refer to as like conspiracy comorbidity. You don't really meet the person who believes just in Atlantis. They typically are part of a nexus of all kinds of other, in my opinion, unwarranted and unfounded beliefs. And what happened to me was that I maintained both positions. I maintained a deep interest in those kind of topics, and I developed a kind of pretty rigorous skepticism about them. And this led me eventually to discovering people like Dr. John Dee and his conversations with angels. I was learning Latin at the time.
Not everyone knows who John Dee was. I know who John Dee was, but please tell the listeners quickly who John Dee was.
John Dee was a 16th century scientist. He was a Hermetic philosopher. He was a mathematician. He was court astrologer to Elizabeth I. He was a spy. I mean, he was sort of everything. He was just a really strange,
A
interesting guy.
Renaissance man with an occult twist.
Yes, I
Yeah,
mean, not that there weren't any Renaissance men without occult twists. That was kind
true.
of what made Renaissance men Renaissance men, and one of the things we've carefully excised from history. We don't like that occult part of them, and so we have promptly forgotten that Newton wrote far more on Bible interpretation and alchemy than he ever did on physics or chemistry, physics or optics. It's an inconvenient fact about Newton. But yeah, I sort of became interested in Dr. John Dee, and folks may know that he worked through a medium and had these long conversations with angels, which
Mhm.
eventually revealed the language of the angels, what is called the celestial speech or the Enochian language. And I think I was learning Latin at the time in high school. And it was a moment where I was looking at this and I could see the fact that this angelic language had conjugations, it had declensions, it was deriving nouns from verbs or verbs from
You were
nouns.
reading original 16th century sources at this point.
Yeah, oh yeah, I was reading, yeah, reading
At
the text.
age 12?
No, I was in high school by then. I must have been 15, 14 at the time.
Okay, but not your average 14-year-old is not running around reading original 16th century sources in Latin.
No, probably not. I mean,
Yeah.
my Latin teacher, God bless her, really put up with a lot. She let me translate an alchemical text from the 16th century as my Latin 2 project.
Brilliant.
Far more interesting than reading Cicero. But yeah, so I got interested in that stuff, and there was a moment where I was looking at this, and I was like, it can't be random. If you're just generating random gibberish, you don't get conjugations and declensions. Something's going on here. Like this is really weird. And it became obvious to me as I ultimately transitioned into college, which was a very accidental and slow transition. I never intended to go to college. My dad was a working class guy from Mississippi who was a pipe fitter, and I worked with him. And I thought basically that my life would more or less be some version of that. And yeah, and it was a moment where these questions just didn't let go of me, and I had to, you know, settle my erstwhile philosophical conscience, to quote Marx. And eventually, when I got into college, I just turned my full attention to these kinds of questions, like what is the upside down of the history of philosophy, the history of science, the history of spirituality, the history of history. What is the upside down of that world? And it turns out there's an enormous upside down, and it's still collectively forgotten, still collectively repressed. I could tell you shocking stories about graduate school when I was in graduate school for philosophy, where I was literally told that things just didn't happen. Things just didn't go that way. Not
Can you give
because they
me
did or
a
they didn't.
shocking example? Please shock me.
So, one of the things that I'm pretty interested in is the foundations of what is we now call rationalism, the philosophical school that is associated with the Enlightenment. It comes roaring out of people like Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza.
Right. And a reaction to the church repression of the Middle Ages to some degree. Yeah.
To some degree, yeah, and it's a complicated story, but at the heart of the story, at least one of the important aspects of the story, is that insofar as Descartes is at the linchpin of the rise of modernity and the rise of rationalism, and I think that he is that it's not often talked about that the fact that he started his entire philosophical program because he had a bunch of mystical dreams. And these mystical dreams involved a divine being coming to him in his dream and revealing to him this new philosophy.
Okay.
And if you read his philosophical works, beginning with the Regula and going all the way through the Discourse on Method, the Meditations, and the Principles, he's writing and rewriting the exact same book over and over and over again. It's like a Beethoven, dun 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 dun. It's obsessive. And it's because he's working out what was revealed to him in a dream years ago. And I wanted to really focus in on the fact that, and one of the things I really wanted to focus in on was like that the origins of modernity and rationalism have their fundamental building block in a series of mystical dreams. Why? And I was told that that didn't happen. You can't talk that way. You can't focus on that, and
Please
you certainly
repeat
can't write
that.
on it.
I'm going to write that down. The foundation, I'm paraphrasing, so correct me.
Yeah.
The foundation of Western empiricism, rationalism.
Rationalism, not empiricism, but
Okay,
rationalism.
rationalism.
Right.
I believe it when I see it type stuff.
Sure.
Rationalism has its foundation, its roots in a series of mystical dreams
Right.
experienced by a man called Descartes.
Yeah. Leibniz was reading Kabbalah. Newton
Who was reading Kabbalah?
Leibniz, the guy who
Okay.
invented calculus, co-invented calculus. As I mentioned, Newton was knee-deep in alchemy and
Yeah.
biblical numerology. And so, and again, I'm not saying that all of modernity is downstream of this stuff that I study called Western esotericism. What I'm saying is that it's there. It played a role. It played an important role, and yet there's something about it that we can't come to grips with. We don't want to admit it's there. Again, I was told in graduate school, it just didn't happen that way. And if you say that it happened that way, you're going to scuttle your entire career.
Right. Yeah, my step grandfather was a professor of philosophy at Boston University, and he was the first to say that you just have to toe a line, and if you don't toe that line, you won't get a job.
Yep.
And I think that's true of actually most of academia.
It's true of all of academia.
Yeah.
But it's especially somehow, and again, I came up through the philosophical ranks. I remember finding Aristotle when I was in middle school, and really remember reading in Aristotle that philosophy begins in awe. And I didn't come from a middle class family. I came from a working class family, and
philosophy begins in awe. You can't just say these things, Justin, and not pause for a power chord. So, hold on. Philosophy begins
in awe. Or bewilderment is even a better translation.
All right. Okay, philosophy.
And that stuff stuck with me. And when I got into the academic side of philosophy, I found that it in some ways had betrayed so much of the things that led me to it to begin with. And I really bristled with it. I found that my philosophical training in graduate school was very unpleasant. I often bucked against things. I asked questions that were apparently inappropriate. I was told, toe the line, tell the story. Modernity begins with Descartes, and it begins with doubt, and we doubt our way to the truth. And therefore, what really matters is doubt. And the most important things you doubt is God and religion.
Right.
And then I was like, that's not what Descartes' arguing. And that's not why Descartes' arguing that. Descartes structures the meditations in order to prove God, to get certainty, and he structures them around a cycle of meditations that are religious in character and last for 6 days, because that's how long God made the world. And you rest on the seventh. The story you're telling is just ipso facto, you have a mythology that you want to tell about modernity. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I'm saying you can't pretend to be the purveyors of truth and philosophical wisdom and also be part of this semi-conscious myth building that you're contributing to at one level, but telling yourself that it's really true on the other.
Right. I think what you're putting your finger on is that one can't say, given that everything is myth, we create mythologies about everything, right? So, as you said, your professors there were creating mythologies about, which were dogmas, which is just another word for mythology, right? It just means a mythology that I might punish you for not believing. But doing that in reaction to another mythology, i.e. a religion or something, and saying, well, our mythology is the mythology. That mythology is not the mythology, you know. But it's all actually a mythology, and at some point it's got to be all right to say, if it's all mythology, well, isn't that kind of interesting?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I would go so far as to say it's all mythology. I would say that and I'm a child of the Enlightenment. I'm pretty convinced that there is a better way of telling the history of philosophy. And that's part of why I'm committed to doing what I'm doing. It's not because I believe in any of the things I talk about. I'm not a believer in esotericism. I'm not a believer in occultism. I don't believe, metaphysically, I'm not committed to any of it. But what I am committed to is telling our history better so that we can live in a better future. Because the more that we live in this this semi-formed, semi-conscious mythology, I don't think that's a good predictor for building a good future, because we haven't come to terms with our own past yet. And so,
in the West, yeah.
And so for me, it's just holding up a mirror to say, this is part of the past, and it's part of the present, and it's going to be part of the future, frankly. And until we come to terms with it and stop telling ourselves that rationalism was born out of a hatred of the church and a hatred of religion, and we rejected superstition for the clarity of science. That just didn't happen. It just simply did not happen that way. And
Not that way, perhaps, no.
the more we continue to tell that story and not admit to us that it is in fact a story, we need to have a more nuanced view of this stuff. And that's my goal, is to say, it doesn't matter whether you believe in whether Descartes, it doesn't really matter whether or not you believe that there was a divine being came to Descartes and really told him the truth about history, philosophy, science, or whatever. What matters is that happened. He believed it happened.
Right. So
And
I've got a
we need
question.
to wrestle with that, come to terms
Right.
with it.
So I've got some questions about that. But quickly before we go there, one of the things I love about what you've done is you've then traced those mythologies. So in your YouTube series, which I just can't recommend listeners to listen enough, just while you're driving around, just listen to them. They're brilliant. But you more or less start at, as far early as you can in Mesopotamia. I haven't found one earlier than that. If you have done one about earlier than that, then I don't know. And then you trace through all of the different Mesopotamian historical belief philosophical systems, because there were many. And then, so Sumeria, Acadia, Babylonian, I'm missing one, Hittites, Medians, blah blah. And then you take us through Egypt in many permutations. You take us through Greece in its many permutations. You take us through Hellenic Greek Egypt in its many permutations. You take us through Roman into early Christian stuff, and then you take us through pretty much up to, well, the Enlightenment.
Yeah, basically the
Yeah,
mandate of the channel ends sometime in the 18th century,
which is
1750s.
about a 6,000 year timeline, right? It's a solid chunk of, and it's where we all come from. You were the son of a pipe fitter in Mississippi, but Mississippi, as we also know, is actually quite a deeply spiritual place,
Hmm.
both from the black point of view, African American point of view, and from the white point of view. What was your family a religious family? Were you Southern Baptists? Were you taking up rattlesnakes and things, or were you going to ecstatic services, or were you
No,
actually born
no.
into a pretty secular household?
It was born into sort of a. My father is a bit of a pessimistic man, so I think that his view of religion was always relatively gloomy. So I don't think he was terribly ever religious, and I think that my family, I wouldn't describe them as being very religious.
Because there's pressure on
Um,
you to be religious in the South.
yeah,
I
the
lived
South
in the
is a
South.
strange.
There's some pressure.
Yeah, the South is a weird place where there's a pressure to conform and there's a pressure to be religious. But deep into the South, there's also a cynicism about things. Southern attitudes, yeah, there's sort of a credulity to cynicism, circuit that runs around.
A pendulum
And
almost. Yeah.
yeah, and you can see this. And, again, I mentioned Faulkner. You read The Sound and the Fury, and they're religious, but also they're like, no, there's no God. Come on. And so, but it was a strange journey because my biological father died when I was quite young, and my mother was kind of held on to some aspects of him and was like, look, just so you know, like your dad was Jewish, and if that's the thing you're interested in, I called the local rabbi and he set up a meeting and he's happy to talk to you about it.
Did they allow Jews in Mississippi? Sorry, I didn't know. Sorry, I'm kidding.
Yeah, there are 200 families, and in fact, the Southern Jews are a strange breed all their own. They were one of the largest chunks of people to fight for the Confederacy, and happily will some of them will happily tell you that the only Jewish person to ever occur on money in this hemisphere where we are was Judah P. Benjamin, the Secretary of State for the Confederacy.
Interesting. I
So
myself am half Ashkenazi.
no,
Jew.
really,
Yeah. The wrong kind. That's why I can make all the Jewish jokes. So it's my dad, which means I get all the anxiety, neurosis, and guilt, but no cigar, no invitation to the club.
I mean you could fix that. You could have both, but I guess if you were inclined. But no, it was, I was like 12. My mom was like, "You're gonna go meet with the synagogue." I remember it was like a rainy, cold Tuesday night,
Mm.
and I met with Rabbi Jimmy Goff. Was a big, imposing guy, and he was sort of stare at you until you said something. And he was like, "Why are you here?" And I'm like, "I have no idea why I'm here." Like,
Good answer.
and he was like, "Well, what do you want from being here?" And I'm like, "I don't know. What is this?" And it was a sort of an interesting journey.
How old are
Uh,
you at that point?
like 12.
Okay.
And yeah, that resulted in, learning Hebrew, starting going to synagogue, and I think much to my parents' horror, I became religious, although in a strange way, and remain religious in a very strange way. I'm married to a rabbi. I would consider myself pretty religious in many ways. But
Well, given that you just said that you don't necessarily buy all of the philosophical, occult, mythological, and religious things that you cover in your episodes, and I think people could sometimes be misled into feeling that you do, because I think one of your great traits is that you can empathize with the people who are presenting these things. So it can sound sometimes like, oh, well, Dr. Sledge must be a, Kabbalist, or he must be a believer in witchcraft, or he must be, because the way you present it, it's very immediate and real. So as skeptical then as dispassionate as you are with ghosts and demons and things, how does that marry up to being religious, not just spiritual, but actually religious? How does religiosity come into that?
for me, religion is how we navigate the world in the way that we produce meaning through systems of symbols. And I think that those systems of symbols, they make the world make sense to us. They provide meaning, they provide structures like community, they provide rituals and these kinds of mechanisms that I think basically everyone has, or everyone needs, whether they know it or not. And to me, what's the right way of putting it? I can take my mythology very seriously without taking any of it literally.
Okay. So am I right in saying that what you are saying is that this is a mythology that has a way of making sense of the world that you find helpful,
Hmm.
but you're not necessarily saying that every word of, as you point out, that library of books, which we've come to call the Torah or the Bible, is necessarily a sacred text by which you must live your life or be damned.
Or that it even contains historical facts.
Yeah.
That I don't know that the Exodus happened. I don't know that Moses was really a real person. I don't think Abraham was really a real person. These are the kind of questions where someone's like, well, if you don't believe that Moses really was a real person and really went up a mountain and really got rules, then why
Mm.
follow the rules? I'm like, because it's the following of the rules that builds the meaning, not the,
But
not
why
the,
those rules and why not other rules?
I guess because those other rules don't make any sense to me and they're foreign to me.
Mm.
And that doesn't make them bad. It just makes them not the rules that are compelling
But
to me.
right, for example, Buddhism, classic common sense, don't be a dick, basically.
Yeah.
Why not that?
Yeah, I guess I find that I don't like sitting around a lot, being quiet. Like I don't find enlightenment to be, yeah, it just seems like a lot of work for something I'm not very interested in. I know that sounds very flippant, but if I have to sit down for an hour a day being quiet
But the
and
Buddhism
meditating,
doesn't tell you you have to do that. I mean,
yeah, or
Buddhism
just or
just
the
says don't be a dick, and don't be a dick in the way that suits you best. If you
yeah.
want to meditate, then by all means meditate, but you don't have to.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, and I'm like, yeah, I guess I don't speak Pali. I don't live in a culture that operates in Pali. I don't believe in reincarnation. My reincarnation strikes me as a terribly interesting. Karma does strikes me as a horrifying belief system.
Right?
Yeah, so it's the system of rules that makes the most sense to me,
Got it.
and also it's because they're diaphanous. I don't even notice them as rules. They're just the way that I live my life.
Right. And
Um,
I think you also, pointed out that culturally, what you're looking at is Western
right,
esotericism. We can include Judaism in that, because even though it's confusing because Judaism and Mesopotamia and all that places, we think of it as the Middle East, but really it's what engenders our Western culture comes
sure,
out of that, because the Greeks and the Romans borrow it, basically, nick it,
right.
basically, or are products of it. So in a funny way, we're all Middle Eastern without knowing it. Yeah.
To some degree, but yeah, it's a thing where I yeah, same with Christianity seems like often a very like in many ways I was just in Egypt and Islam seems like a much closer religion to me. For instance, I could easily imagine, and I have, like I could pray in a mosque, that's the kind of thing that makes them very easy sense to me. It's very like transparent how that would work. Churches seem very foreign places to me. When I go inside of a Coptic Orthodox church or sort of Catholic church, I'm like, it was funny because I had a friend of mine who she switched from being Catholic to being pagan, sort of spirit,
No, same
pagan,
thing.
yeah, spirit, sort of, so and that was my opinion. I was like, oh, they're basically the same. I tend to look at Catholicism and paganism as being very similar, like, and with all their saints and all these rituals and all these like lighting candles and these like the incense and stuff. I'm like, those look very similar to me. And she was horrified, but because for her, she had abandoned something as a rebellion against it and transferred to something else that she thought was completely the opposite. And it was something very shocking to her to hear someone say, and it's funny because I was talking to one of my Muslim tour guides when we were in Egypt, and we shared in common the fact that we didn't understand. It was like a very, it was a very that the churches were very foreign to us, and it's funny that we couldn't be more different in terms of our geographical history, our language history, but mythologically we were closer in the way that we made sense of the world than we were, to the Catholic cathedral that's literally in my neighborhood.
And it's interesting to me when you say that because I had this weird upbringing where I was listening this morning while I was picking my horse's poo to and I was actually a chorister at the temple in London. So that's the second oldest building in London. It's now the seat of law, the judges and the barristers. It's their church. And the school I went to provided the choir boys either for that church or the Chapel Royal, which was at that point, the Queen's Chapel, now the King's. And you would be drafted into one or the other. And interestingly, you're there. I'm not baptized. I'm not circumcised. I'm neither Jewish nor Christian. And some of the other boys in the choir were like Muslims and Hindus. We would just pick for our voices. But it was very, very clear that you were in this kind of seat of power. And there are the effigies of all the Marshall family or the English Knights Templar lying there. There's a copy of Magna Carta. But they don't talk to you about any of that. But the ritual of it, the High Anglican ritual, which is effectively Catholic, while being Protestant, I don't see much difference between that and a synagogue, honestly. And perhaps that's because I had this perspective of being colonial African, even though so I worked a lot with these people behind me in their systems of the hunter-gatherer shamanic traditions, and which is effectively very similar to mysticism within any religion, really. So I don't see a lot of difference in any organized religion. I lived in India for a bit too, and I remember going into temples, but effectively chanting in these particular tones and big resonant stone buildings and chaps wandering about telling you what to do and what not to do. And with a sort of slight air of you'll be in trouble if you don't type thing. And this idea of, punishment and reward. And that's not, for example, in the hunter-gatherer sense, that's just not even there. But there is divinity and there are ancestors and there is the divine, but not in a sort of an organized way in which and also not in a way that you don't have to be reverent. So let's say, for example, there is a healing going on. It usually comes out with healing, and the healer is there going into an altered state of consciousness, and you'll see them bleeding and pulling stuff out of people, and it's like, whoa, I'm actually seeing that. But right next to them, there's a bloke smoking a cigarette, like flirting with a girl, and there's kids just running about, and no one is supposed to be approaching it with this sense of reverence. Yet at the same time, there is awe, this much greater thing that, and presumably, given that we all sort of come from that, and then we found all these ways of expressing it. But what we're really, or are we not? I shouldn't say what we're already doing, because that's a really misled thing to say. Are we not just all talking about love?
I don't know. I mean, I guess there's two things that I would think is that I would be slow to compare hunter-gatherer religion today with what we may have come from, because I don't know that we know in lieu of texts, we don't really know what they were doing in 100,000 years ago. So I'm slow to extrapolate from the present too far back into the past. And then I think that religion, when I look at, I'll give an example, for instance, ancient Israelite religion, there's not much love there. That is a tribal god
Yeah, well,
who's
we're
there
talking about
doing.
Enlil, more or less, aren't we? We're talking about that's the first bloke coming along with a big beard who's going to slap you on the bottom for being a naughty boy, right?
Yeah, I mean Enlil, Yahweh,
Yeah,
Indra. I think that once you get territorial, once you get city states, the
yeah,
gods start to look a lot like the people ruling those city states.
yeah, exactly.
And so, and I think that underneath it all there is no underneath it all. It depends on the material, historical circumstances upon which rests these religious expressions. And I think
Right, but
those
there
are,
is there not a mystical thread that runs through most religions where people seem to be able to find common ground?
I don't think so.
Or you don't think so?
Yeah, I am notoriously a non-perennialist. This is a notorious fact about me in the religious studies world is that many people who come to Western esotericism or esotericism and mysticism typically come at it from the point of view of perennialism.
What does perennialism mean?
So it says that at the core of religion is sort of a mystical center, and that at that mystical center, religions grow out of that mystical center, and therefore Judaism is an expression of it. Shamanism, all the different religions are somehow grow out of that core mysticism. And so this is a position held by people like Eliade and Jung and William James and sort of classic perennialists. I tend to come from the traditionalist camp, which is very unpopular. For both the right and the left don't like traditionalism.
Well, if you're pissing off both sides, it usually means you're onto something good.
Yeah, maybe, or you're just going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. But I'm of the camp typically that says that there is no core. That when you study the religions closely enough, they're much more different than they are the same, and that if there is a universal, it can only be known through the particular, and therefore only individual traditions exist. And those are hyper local, hyper specific, and often are more marked by their discontinuity than by their continuity. So, for instance, a good example of this is we tend to think that there's a lot of continuity between Israelite religion and Judaism. But if you study the two, they couldn't be more discontinuous. They're extraordinarily different from each other. Now, of course, there's connective tissue, the uniting them. But if you were to drop a modern Orthodox Jew into the temple 2,000 years ago, they would be as lost as anyone else as to
What would be the major difference that they would see?
They would be in a giant building killing animals and burning things. And that would be the principal mechanism by which you would interact with your God, is by killing animals and burning stuff, typically. And most of us would not be allowed into that building.
Okay.
There would be a distinct group of people allowed in, and you would very statistically be unlikely to be one of them.
So that would be the Jewish temple right about the time that the Romans go in there and destroy it and the diaspora begins. Okay. Let's go back 1,000 years before that. What would the temple look like then?
A lot smaller, but similar. It's still mostly a priesthood run by very small, but basically a family, and then there would be a monarch, and that monarch would be in relationship to that priesthood, somehow often married into it or part of that family. And there would be a series of pilgrimage festivals in which people would be expected to come to that temple, and it would be, again, mostly slaughtering animals and burning things, incense.
At that stage, if we're now 3,000 years back,
Mm-hmm.
would that Jewish temple be a monotheistic or a polytheistic, or
Probably polytheistic,
right?
or
So that would seem
henotheistic.
to me a big difference, right?
Yeah,
So they'd
henotheistic, probably. If you're thinking about sort of 1000 BCE, it probably would have been the case that the Israelites would have worshipped their God as the best God, sort of like my dad can beat up your dad, but your dad still exists.
Okay.
He's just not the dad. He's just not my dad.
And in that temple, would we hedge our bets by sacrificing to your dad as well, just in case, because you never know, type thing?
Depends on the monarch, but yeah, in many cases, it seems like the monarchs typically. I'll give one example: is that if you married a woman from a local powerful nation, like the Phoenicians, then she's going to bring along her gods, and there's going to be an expectation that
But
her
would they be
gods.
allowed in your temple, or would they have to have their own temple?
They'd probably be allowed in your temple. I mean, we have evidence for that in the Hebrew Bible. And some
Okay.
of that, some people did not like that. So the prophets did not like that because they were really on team our dad, and they didn't think anyone else's dad should be in there.
Mm.
But no, you would go back in time far enough, and you would see that this God Yahweh had a wife.
As you know, if you followed any of my work, I'm an autism dad, and we have a whole career before this podcast in helping people with neurodivergence, either who are professionals in the field. Are you a therapist? Are you a caregiver? Are you a parent? Or are you somebody with neurodivergence? When my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism in 2004, I really didn't know what to do. So I reached out for mentorship, and I found it through an amazing adult autistic woman who's very famous, Dr. Temple Grandin. And she told me what to do. And it's been working so amazingly for the last 20 years that not only is my son basically independent, but we've helped countless thousands of others reach the same goal, working in schools, working at home, working in therapy settings. If you would like to learn this cutting edge neuroscience-backed approach, it's called Movement Method. You can learn it online. You can learn it very, very simply. It's almost laughably simple. The important thing is to begin. Let yourself be mentored as I was by Dr. Grandin and see what results can follow. Go to this website, newtrailslearning.com. Sign up as a gold member. Take the online movement method course. It's in 40 countries. Let us know how it goes for you. We really want to know. We really want to help people like me, people like you out there live their best life, to live free, ride free, see what happens. Right. Well, that was my next question. So at what point does my dad become only my dad? And what about dad and mum and dad, mum, brother, and his mates? Like, at what point does Yahweh become a single thing and not
huge debate.
one of several things?
A huge debate. Some scholars would say not until second and third centuries of the Common Era. I tend to think it's a bit earlier than that. Yeah. Yeah, they
evidence to support that?
There's evidence to say that the Israelites continue to believe in deities, mostly sort of like sub-deities in the sense of angels and entities being converted into sub.
So do you think that those original multi-gods got subverted, just became, okay, well, we'll make those guys angels and demons?
Yeah, they got demoted into angels and demons. We certainly know that happened in Christianity. I tend to think that we see the first expressions of monotheism in Deutero-Isaiah, so during the Babylonian exile. But
give us a timeline on that. That would be what?
So 586 is when the Babylonian exile begins. So I would say sometime in the 6th century BCE. I think we get
so it's contemporary with like Mycenaean Greece and Homer and stuff, more or less, give or take.
A little later, actually.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's late. I mean, it's much later than people think it is.
Okay.
Yeah,
because it's not how it's presented, right, at all. You know. So when Moses goes up the mountain, is he talking to Yahweh, Yahweh's brother, Yahweh's wife, or Yahweh's mates?
I mean, I think by then the Moses story is pretty late. So
when is the Moses story?
Well, it's set historically around 1500, 1300 BCE, but I think it was probably written closer to 600 BCE.
Right.
So I think the story is a
really
bit
quite
later.
late.
I think that there's memories of something that go back earlier, but I think the Moses story itself is relatively late.
Because that's not much before, you know, your Socrateses and your Platos start coming along. I mean, there's only about 100 years in it.
Yeah, it's this is the so-called axial age, right? Where Ezekiel and Socrates and Parmenides and Confucius and all those guys were around and almost within a couple hundred years of each other.
It almost makes you wonder if they were meeting in some altered state of consciousness place elsewhere and saying, why don't we just come up with a bunch of stuff that sounds really the same and just get out of everybody later?
I think that I can't imagine they would have liked each other. I imagine that Socrates and Confucius would not have seen eye to eye. I think Socrates would have bothered Confucius to the ends of the earth. And
why?
Ezekiel, because I think that Confucius had a very clear idea about how the world should be structured after the Warring State period, and I think Socrates had a very clear idea that no one had a clear idea of anything. And I think that Ezekiel would have hated them because he'd have seen them as idolaters, and he was really all about like reinstituting the power of his God and quickly bringing back a third temple and ushering in some kind of apocalyptic renovation of the world. I don't think they'd have gotten along at all.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's go back to your discovery then of John Dee. As we're in your teenage self. You are reading an Elizabethan occultist who's also, as you say, a courtier, a spy, an ambassador, an advisor to good Queen Bess, who is still to this day one of our most successful British monarchs. She lays the foundations for the British Empire and the Bank of England and everything that followed. Our greatest act of piracy that, is still to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, it was John Dee that coined the phrase British Empire. That's his phrase.
Okay, so you have a guy who's fairly practical and savvy and can also navigate the internecine conflicts of a court like that and have some longevity there because it was easy to fall out of favor, particularly if you're pretending to talk to the divine, because any monarch worth their salt's going to say, all right, well then, give me lots of goodies. And if you can't come up with the goodies, then, things might not go so well for you. So was he talking to angels? And if he wasn't talking to angels, why was he spending so much time saying he was?
So he never talked to the angels directly, right? He always talked to them indirectly via his scryer, a dude named Edward Kelly, who was a convicted con man. In fact, he had his ears cut off for previous con jobs. And he even presented himself to Dee as under a false name, an alias. He called himself Edward
But
Talbot.
Dee was not a gullible man.
I think he was a very gullible man. I think he was very smart. I've met lots of smart people who are also extremely gullible because the people tell them what they want to hear. And I think that Dee had run up basically up against a wall, and he admits as much. And he was on this quest for what he calls radical truths. And I think he had grown exhausted with trying to find them the conventional way, which is to say, using equipment and using reason to do it. And I think that for him, he wanted to short the circuit, and the way you shorten the circuit is go straight to the people that designed the whole world. And you go right back to God, and you interact via the people that built the world, and that's the angels. And so...
But this was a risky thing to do. I mean, okay, he wasn't in Spain or Rome, but previous to Elizabeth, you have Bloody Mary. She's burning everyone in sight. After Elizabeth, you've got King James comes in. He burns everyone in sight. It's dangerous to go around saying you're doing this sort of thing.
Oh, he didn't go around saying it. He kept it very quiet. Yeah, this was a very quiet thing.
Was he telling Queen Bess that he was doing it?
I don't know that he communicated to her. And also remember, just a year after he starts this business of talking to angels, he's on the continent for the next 6 years. And he's in the Holy Roman Empire, basically under the protection of Rudolph II, who himself was a very mercurial, strange guy. And so I think that there was a lot more latitude.
He was an occultist, it's true.
And he was able to move around. And the Inquisition did try to get him. They did invite him.
Oh, they did.
They did. And they knew that something was going on. But, I mean, Dee was cautious. Edward Kelly was not cautious. He got them in a good bit of trouble. But I think also that Elizabeth needed Dee alive because he was useful. He was and I don't think she cared the weird things he got up to at night, as long as he didn't make a big deal about it. Because there was lots of people doing strange things. And
don't do it in the street and frighten the horses.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I think even James knew that he was doing this stuff. And Dee publicly told James, well, put me on trial for witchcraft. I'll prove to you that I'm not doing anything bad. Mm-hmm. And James declined it. And this is the days of the Witchfinder General and all that. Killed 200 women. James knew that killing Dee would be a bad look. And so basically we gave him a pension and let him alone. So again, this is the kind of thing where we typically think of the period of the witch trials as being a no-no time for any kind of occult shenanigans. But there were lots of occultists at that time publishing. I mean, Cornelius Agrippa published the 3 books of occult philosophy in 1533. The Inquisition tried to intervene, but ultimately they were shut down by the local archbishop. The local archbishop shut them down.
The local archbishop where?
In Cologne, in Germany. And, that's the heart of the trials. Witch trials were, horrifying in Germany.
Absolutely. Where I'm sitting is in a village called Niedenhausen, which is next door to a town called Idstein. And Idstein has a tower called the Witches' Tower. And
Hmm.
outside they have a monument to all of the witches that were kept there before execution. All of the names, because they're all in the parish register.
Yeah.
Interestingly, about a third of them are men.
Yeah.
And the hill which we pass on the way to Idstein, which interestingly you also leave the Roman Empire and you go through what's called the limes, which was, you probably know, as the line of embankments that went from the mouth of the Rhine down to the Danube. You pass over that and there's a reconstructed Roman tower, and then very quickly on your right there's the hill where they killed them all. And then down the road in Bamberg, yeah, they invented a special furnace where, because they cut down so much forest to burn so many people, that they had to come up with a more efficient furnace to
Mm.
burn whole families at one time, to not run out of firewood. Crazy. So in that case, why could some people get away with it?
Because they were wealthy, educated men and not poor people. And also because typically,
But they did put to death wealthy, educated men if it was politically expedient.
often for political reasons and not for reasons of sorcery. It did happen. I mean, we do have people that were executed, like Cecco d'Ascoli, who was executed in the 14th century. But almost always, when you see an execution for sorcery, it's a precursor for some other kind of political move. It's a Game of Thrones thing.
Like with the
But
Templars, they're
yeah, the
all
Templars,
homosexuals. They
yeah,
don't want to pay
right,
the debt, right?
right. The Templars are executed because the king, Philip the Fourth, is badly in debt
Yeah.
to them, and so that's the best way of dealing with your creditors is killing them all. So, but in the cases of witch trials, is that the crime that you were accused of in the witch trials was a very specific crime called maleficia, and this was a what is now called by scholars the elaborated theory of witchcraft, which meant that you signed a pact with the devil to wage a war against Christianity. And clearly, John Dee is a Christian. Agrippa was a Christian. Bruno, not so much. And that's what got him ultimately burned alive. Although even then, it was the case that he was an ex priest who had said things about the Trinity that were heretical and refused to recant them. But you'd be surprised how few educated occultists were executed. Paracelsus never persecuted. I don't want to say they had good lives, and they certainly had to be careful and they had to be on the move. But Kelly also, the guy literally talking to the angels, he rats them out on several occasions. He tells the truth about what's going on. He ultimately dies jumping out of a prison cell. He's ultimately arrested or ultimately arrested and put under house arrest so that he could do alchemy, and tries to escape and ultimately breaks his leg badly and dies. So being an occultist in the 16th century wasn't the dissonance that people thought that it is. But being a poor woman who curses a lot and is on the outs with her neighbors, that was probably a dissonance.
If you were Kelly, and you were reading the language of the angels there as a teenager, and asking this question, well, hold on, this seems very, very structured. This seems very, very, this isn't some random thing. So, was there any truth in it? What I mean by that, do you think Kelly actually did think, was Kelly in an altered state of consciousness where he was somehow downloading some sort of information, or it was bubbling into his perception somehow? Or do you think he actually sat down and said, I need to make up something pretty complex, even though I'm not a linguist? What was going on?
I think it was both. I think that we have these sort of binary ways of thinking that either it was fraud or it was revelation. And I think that it's the mind can operate in both at once. I think of someone like,
Fraudulation.
yeah, fraudulation. I think of someone like Joseph Smith, right, who
Yeah.
channeled the Book of Mormon. People are like, oh, he's just a fraud. And I'm like, I don't think he's just a fraud. And this is the same way I think of Kelly. I think there's a way of thinking about what they're doing that is neither fraud nor revelation. And I do think that Kelly was in an altered state of consciousness. I think there's good reason to believe that from the diaries. But do I think that he was talking to angels? I don't know. The data for that is inconclusive to me. What I will say is that while the language isn't random, it never betrays non-English syntax. It
Ah,
seems to derive words from languages that Kelly knew. The angels that Kelly speaks to make mistakes both in arithmetic and in Latin. Dee has to correct their arithmetic and their Latin at times. The
Thought that was
angels seem to
educational.
strategically know things and not know things that Kelly knows and doesn't know. The angels seem to plagiarize Agrippa at times. So
Okay.
when you get to reading them, and again, when I was 14 and 15 reading them, it was just bewildering because I had never, how good is my Latin? How much do I know about Cornelius Agrippa? How much do I really know about alchemy? Now that I'm a bit older and I have read this material and I know it, I'm like, hold on, the angels are making very conspicuous kinds of mistakes,
Mm.
and they're the kind of mistakes that Kelly makes. And so again, am I going to get in the business of saying they weren't talking to angels? Well, I can't say they weren't because you can't prove a negative. That's just philosophically not possible. But is it conspicuous that the Enochian language doesn't have any non-English phonemes? Right? There are no glottal stops. Looking at the hunter-gatherer in the background, there's no like sounds like
There's no
or-
clicks.
right. And if they were speaking a language and all of a sudden there was a sound that you hear only in Osa, that would be weird for an Englishman who had never been to the land of Bantu people to do that, or a glottal stop, or a voice pharyngeal fricative.
Wouldn't somebody like Dee just say, "Oh, well, of course, divine revelation comes, in the form that the brain of the person, the mind of the person receiving it can best understand because God speaks all languages, blah blah."
Yeah, you could. I mean, then why just not do it in English? I mean, when the angel Gabriel tells the Prophet Muhammad, "I've given to you an Arabic Quran so you can understand it." Well, that's pretty convenient.
Fair enough. Yeah.
It'd have been a thing where if they'd have given him a Mayan Quran, that would have been impressive. If Muhammad would have gotten the Quran in Mayan, I would convert to Islam immediately.
Right.
That would tell me something really weird had happened. But the Enochian language,
Okay,
but-
that's something that confuses me. Why Enochian? It's got nothing to do with the Book of Enoch, right?
so it does and it doesn't. So to be clear, Dean Kelly and the Angels never call it Enochian. That's a modern thing that we call it. They always refer to it as the celestial speech or the Adamical speech. So the reason why it's associated with Enoch is because Enoch wrote it down and allegedly wrote it down in a series of tablets, and those tablets were preserved and ultimately destroyed, and then the angels re-reveal it. And so the last time anyone had access to it was Enoch. And so that's why it gets called Enochian.
Do the angels say this to Kelly and Dee?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. And there are at least two Enochian languages in the text. There's there's a series of 49 by 49 grids that are filled with letters and numbers, which are said to be the Enochian language. And then there's the system of calls, which are like psalms, and those have glosses. And we have translations of those. And so we can see, for instance, that the word earth in that text is kaosk, Chaosg, which seems to be derivative of the Greek chaos. But
Okay. So let's assume that people like these occultists were somewhere between credulous of their own experiences, somewhere between altered states of consciousness, somewhere between true seekers after truth, somewhere between con men when it suited them, and various points in between, and sort of created a canon, if you like, of occult philosophy. That the Enochian thing, talking about mythologies and canons of mythologies. So Enoch, the Book of Enoch. So again, for listeners that don't know about it, super interesting thing. Why? Because it's a bloke going up to heaven and encountering effectively the celestial throne. And there's a bunch of, if I get this right, there's a bunch of angels or celestial beings arguing about whether we, monkeys down here, should be allowed to continue. And then there's, because we're disruptive, and then there's a Satan, not the Satan, a judge, a prosecutor. So it seems to be what it means. But it seems that we get a reprieve somehow. And then Enoch comes back down and says, lads, got to pull our socks up. And then after he dies, he goes back up again and somehow becomes the angel Metatron later on. Mythologies. Now, as you know, I'm going to use the Anunnaki word. So to my mind, one of the great fun mythologies that's come out of the more modern age is the whole ancient astronauts theory because it's enjoyable and it also ties in with the ancient Sumerian older stuff that we know of, written downy stuff, saying, we had these kings who lived for, way, way longer than anyone possibly could because they sort of came from somewhere there. And these gods actually were among us because they were actually from somewhere else and they came down and they made us so that, we could in various ways. And then later on, you have someone like Zachariah Sitchin coming along as Azerbaijani or Armenian, can't remember, but saying, okay, I have translated these ancient cuneiform things, and they say that yes, this happened, and actually these old gods, Enki and Lil, and all of these things from Mesopotamia, these are actually aliens, and then they become mythologized later on. They bugger off somewhere around 1000 BC or so because they're somehow the work here is done, but they leave us with the memory, and we keep it going through the deities and blah blah blah. Well, maybe they're still around, or maybe there's lizard people, or maybe this, or maybe that. And I'm always interested in this because people have a big emotional reactions to this. Like they either seem to go for full on credulity. Yes, it's ancient aliens, and part of me goes, well, honestly, why not? If you've got an Atlantis and Lemuria, but you've got Plato saying, yeah, there's this Atlantis thing. Is it allegory? I don't know, but they're talking about it. Or, it's the other way. No, absolutely not. Blah, blah, blah. And the timeline is as we know it. And then they find places like Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, which seems to be earlier than Sumeria, maybe. I don't know. People argue about it. People will continue to argue about it, right? But isn't it in those arguments and those mythologies that the fun lies? Or what do you think of all that?
I don't know that the arguing about the ancient alien stuff to me is very fun. I think it's I mean, it would be fun if like Zachariah Sitchin's translations of these texts were at all reliable, and they're just not. So I'm all about having academic fun when we're actually, when we're all playing by the same rules. And if the rules are I get to make up stuff and call it translations, and then we're not playing by the same rules anymore. In the same way that, you can take the net down, but you can't call that tennis anymore. But you're doing something, and it might be fun, but it's not tennis. And so when the ancient alien folks want to take the net down, then I can just say, well, we're not playing the same game anymore. And therefore, to me, it's not a fun conversation.
But if we're looking at mythologies, what makes one mythology okay to look at and discuss and another one not?
I would say that they don't think that what they're doing is a mythology. They think that what they're doing is actually telling the history of.
But I would say not limited to the ancient alien people, right? I mean, there's lots of people who believe mythologies that are questionable.
Right. In the same way that I would, if a Haredi Jewish person came to me and says, you have to believe that Moses went up on a mountain and got rules, literally, that actually happened, I would say, it's fun to play Dungeons and Dragons. It's another thing to think you're an elf.
Can't I be an elf?
You can think you are one, and you can cosplay, and you can dress up as an elf.
Exactly.
But the moment you think that you really are an elf, you've crossed over into some kind of psychosis.
Well, sure. Or altered state of consciousness. I mean, it's a fine line between, right?
Well, I think that an altered state of consciousness is not a belief system. I think it's when you concretize beliefs that are derivative of bad data, and Zachariah Sitchin is a great example of just bad data. Then that becomes you're believing in a state of affairs that's contrary to what we know about what those cuneiform tablets actually say. And
what do the cuneiform tablets actually say
about the Anunnaki
and stuff?
Nothing. It's not.
But they do they not say there was on the king list, for example? Do they not say there were these chaps who lived impossibly long lives, in a mythological sort of way, and there was this king, this king, this king. Starts with sort of almost tens of thousands of years and then whittles down to thousands of years and whittles down to hundreds of years. And then there's us lot, living normal lifespans. And is there not some stuff in the cuneiform script saying we got knowledge from the gods? Or is it not there at all?
Right. It's there in the sense that, Enlil and, that these other gods, Ea and stuff, they communicate with people, but that's just true of most religions, that the gods show up and teach people stuff.
But this is the earliest religion that we know of, right?
I don't know if it's the earliest written text of a religion that we know
Right.
of, but I would
The
say,
earliest canon that we have access
right.
to. You're right.
But I would say that Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük they had religions. We don't know. It's hard to interpret what those sites mean because they didn't write things down.
Sure.
But I mean, Africans were having religious beliefs for 200,000 years prior to that.
Indeed.
You know, whatever the strange animals they were painting in the caves of Lascaux, I'm fairly confident that's something like religion. So I would be very slow. I mean, the Sumerians are the first people to write down things, but even the Sumerians don't agree with each other. Like from city state to city state, they have disagreements about which gods are really the best gods and which ones are why the world got flooded. Or so if you even look at the Sumerian literature, we're not getting one story.
Yeah.
We're getting rival city states and their stories about why, you know, why this happened as opposed to that happened. And because unlike in Egypt, there's no hegemon binding the city states of ancient Sumeria together until you get to Sargon. And Sargon's not Sumerian, he's Akkadian. And so.
What's the difference?
The Sumerians were
they're all people living in the same area, right? More or less.
They're living in somewhat the same area. The Sumerians are primarily living in southern Mesopotamia. We don't know where they came from. They're admittedly mysterious, and their language isn't related to any other languages that we know of. The Akkadians,
aliens. Sorry,
could be. I mean, it could be. I mean, there's lots of languages like their languages.
Oh.
You know, we have Basque and Caucasus languages that are similar structurally to Sumerian and their ergativity and stuff like that, being agglutinative languages and stuff. But
okay, you've got these different people living in this area between these two rivers, not Tigris and Euphrates,
right.
over some thousands of years, making these city-states, and we don't know of anything before them that was that organized, right?
Well, we don't know of anything organized in terms of living in cities,
right? And
it's definitely
down that we can recover and translate.
And read. I mean, yeah, we can't read the Indus River Valley script, and it doesn't seem like the people at Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük and those sites in Turkey wrote. And also we know why writing emerged in Sumeria and the places that it did emerge. It was because they needed it for bureaucratic reasons. They had.
Why did the other people not need it for bureaucratic reasons, do you think? Why do you think Göbekli Tepe people didn't need a bureaucracy? Because they were doing massively organized building projects and things.
Well, I mean, that site's not that big. If you look at, it, if you go to it and look at it, measure it, it's monumental, but it's not very big. And so, that building project would have taken some degree of central planning and organization, but nothing on the register of Ur, where you have irrigation and, elaborate agriculture and trade, so those are orders of magnitude in terms of difference. In fact, to me, the most impressive thing about Göbekli Tepe is not the fact that they build it, but the fact that they buried it. Yeah. Why in the world go through all the trouble to build that thing, then to use it for a while, then to bury it? Burying it must have been in many ways, just as Herculean use of resources and calories in building it. That to me is the more interesting thing about Göbekli Tepe. But
did they bury it, or was it buried?
Yeah, I don't think it was buried on accident. I think that the data indicates that it was intentionally
filled in.
Filled in. That's why it's so well preserved, is because some people decided to fill in. That's weird.
Can you just, for the people that don't know what Göbekli Tepe is, just give us a timeline? What's Göbekli Tepe, and why is it older, and how much older is it than the Sumerian stuff?
I think that the data on Göbekli Tepe now is 10,000 BCE, 12,000 BCE.
Right.
I forget exactly.
It's as old behind Sumeria as we are in front of it, more or less.
Yeah. And it's part of the. It seems to be part of the same culture that Çatalhöyük and those Jericho and those Neolithic societies were part of some kind of trade systems. We don't know what Göbekli Tepe was. It may have been a religious site. It may have been a site for trade. It may have been both. They may have come there for pilgrimages and then traded stuff like seeds and stuff and then moved on. Agriculture, it seems like, emerged in Anatolia through selective breeding of grass, and those grasses became grains.
Did the grass domesticate us, or did we domesticate the grass? That seems to be the.
I mean, it seems like, at least in that area, That's where you get some primitive Immer and stuff like that. And so I think that it probably goes both ways. I think there's an
Yeah.
accident that's involved. Also, probably women did it. I mean, that's who's doing the gathering at that time. So I
Mm.
imagine that breakthrough was pioneered by some lady scientist whose name will be mysterious forever. She must have noticed, right, that this type of grass produces these type of seeds, and that if you plant these two together, they grow big, and you have to manually knock them off. The wind doesn't knock them off. You have to manually knock them off, but they do fall off just by shaking them. And they kept breeding and breeding and breeding until eventually they get
Yeah.
things like Immer.
So, okay, so Göbekli Tepe, older than Sumeria, gets buried. Now, let's go back to some myths, flood myths. So we know everyone's got one, and they seem to pop up all in every corner of the planet, more or less. What's going on there? And do you believe in the Younger Dryas stuff? And again, for the listeners, I'll just give them a quick background.
Yeah.
Younger Dryas being the last ice age. Some people believe that there was some environmental cataclysm, perhaps induced by stuff going on around our planet in one form or another that caused a big flood, big melting of ice caps and so on. But what we do know is there was some sort of flood, and everyone seems to talk about it, and it seems to affect everybody's worldview. What's going on with that, do you think?
I mean, I'm not, so I have to be careful. I'm not sure that every culture has a flood story. I mean, I know
Let's
that,
just say a lot of them do.
yeah, some do. And I can say that, I mean, I don't know if the ancient Chinese had a flood story or,
I think there are Chinese flood stories. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that I don't know. I mean, not
Okay.
being an expert in those mythologies, so I have to see. I'd be careful to say that like the ancient Egyptians, I'm not sure had a flood story. But I think the reason why the Mesopotamians had a flood story is because they had floods, and they had very cataclysmic floods. If you compare the flooding of the Nile to the flooding of the Tigris and the Euphrates, the flooding of the Nile was very predictable. And in fact, some anthropologists even link to the relatively positive outlook of the Egyptians, both on the afterlife and on this life, to the relatively stable society that you had in ancient Egypt, where the floods came. They were predictable. It was hard to invade Egypt.
Hmm.
That they had a relatively, not to say it didn't get invaded, it did get invaded. The Hyksos invaded it and stuff. But even when they invaded, it didn't cause a huge amount of social disruption. And that's unlike Mesopotamia, which was the Nile, the Euphrates, and the Tigris flood randomly. They flood catastrophically. Their cities are not built out of stone, they're built out of mud brick. And when the Tigris and Euphrates flooded, it destroyed whole cities. I mean, you could wipe an entire city out in a day.
Mm.
And literally wiped them off the face of the earth. I mean, you take mud brick structures like a ziggurat, and you have a
Ziggurat
cataclysmic
being a type
flood.
of pyramid, right?
A kind of pyramid, yeah, step pyramid. That's built of mud brick. That's nothing compared to, a flood. And if you look at the literature of the Sumerians and the Akkadians, it's extremely pessimistic, very pessimistic literature. They have a very dour dour outlook on life. And I would say that the flood myth develops because they dealt with floods, and they dealt with floods that ended their world. That is to say, they had cities that were just wiped out, and this became sort of an archetypal story that they told. And when the writers of the Hebrew Bible, they tended to look much more toward the Mesopotamians for their cultic information, mostly because they were under the imperial thumb of those people, and they tended to copy them. And I think that's where we get the Noah story being copied, not word for word by no means, but there's certainly enough similarities between the Utnapishtim story that we get in the Mesopotamian mythology to the Noah story. But even the Noah story doesn't internally make sense. For instance, when God tells Noah to go put the animals on the ark, one story has clearly you should take 7 of the clean animals and 2 of the unclean. Well, how does Noah even know which ones are clean and unclean? That's not been disclosed that won't be disclosed until Moses' day. And then a few lines later, it says, oh, take 2 of every kind. And that's what we see in all the pictures of Noah's Ark, as 2 of every kind. But the text seems to have 2 different versions of the story sitting side by side, where there clearly was some version of it where Moses was going to take a lot more animals with him. So yeah, I'm reticent to say that it's a worldwide ubiquitous flood story. I think there are Mesopotamian flood stories, of which some variant of that flood story does end up in the Hebrew Bible.
Right. I mean, there are definitely flood stories mythologically Far East,
They're, yeah,
Central America, Africa, they definitely exist.
yeah,
Uh, these are open questions that are just, I think, fun to discuss. Um,
right. And without me knowing more about those flood stories, it's
yeah,
hard for me
I
to
think your
weigh
point
in.
about the flooding of the rivers is a very good one. Okay, so let's go to another myth, Atlantis. So you've got Plato saying, my ancestor Solon went to Egypt, and some lads there in a temple said, listen here, Solon, there was this thing called Atlantis, and it was this and it was that. And then it disappeared in a great cataclysm. And then Plato, of course, bequeaths this myth to us, and it goes on and becomes all the things that it's become. What are your thoughts?
Mostly because of a Confederate, ex-Confederate soldier.
Oh, do tell.
Yeah, it's William Donnelly, I think was his name.
Okay.
It's Don. I think it was Donnelly. Donnelly was a ex-Confederate soldier who wrote the first book that really popularized the idea that Atlantis might be a real place. Before that, I don't think anyone believed that. I don't think that, or I don't know of any data to indicate that people thought it was anything other than a myth. Because Plato often will put myths at the end of his dialogues,
Sure.
like the myth of and other myths at the end of the Republic. The myth of Atlantis, I think, occurs at the end of Critias? I can't remember. Crito? One of
But
them. I think
it's tricky, isn't it? Because he talks about an actual ancestor of his own.
yeah, I mean,
Like when he
in the
talks
way
about
that
that's also the name of a real place. So what's going on with that?
yeah, I mean, it's, I think that it's creative, historical fiction, right? He tells the story of Solon going to Heliopolis and learning all this stuff. The question for me when it comes to, and then of course we have the New Age Atlantis stuff that kicks
Mm.
up with Edward Casey. So where he thinks that it's by the Isle of Bimini, and then people
Can you
find the so-called Bimini
tell
Wall.
listeners? Not everyone's going to know who Edmund.
So Edward Casey was
Edmund
a trance medium who he was called the sleeping prophet. He would go into altered states of consciousness and
1920s or so, right?
yeah, I think so. Early 20th century, yeah. And he
Yeah.
would reveal all kinds of everything from medical treatments to mythological history. And Atlantis played a big role in his.
He was the guy who said he was tapping into something called the Akashic Record,
I
i.e.,
think so.
collecting
And this is a relationship to Blavatsky and theosophy and stuff like this.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think that the Atlantis story is. So for me, the question is historically, when did people begin to believe that it was a potentially real place? And I think that that's datable to Connolly.
After the American Civil War.
Yep, yep. I don't think that prior to that, people thought that it was a real place. You sometimes have maps that people sort of guess that it may have been over there. There'll be land masses they think were Atlantis or whatever. But I think that part of the reason why people like that story is that it's about imperial arrogance being punished. And I think we like to see bullies get their comeuppance. And Atlantis was a bully, which is a really interesting story because we now tell it as if, and again, there's lots of variants of it in the New Age movement and other kinds of things where they think of it as sort of a utopia that seeded all the world's knowledge and this kind of stuff. But it's pretty clearly a bully country in the original telling, and they were just mean and arrogant, and the gods destroyed them for good reason.
Right.
I
For
just,
being wankers, basically.
yeah, they were mean. I mean, but I like the fact that this story, this mythology has changed. That it goes from this is a story, this is a cautionary tale of, again, Plato's writing to Athenians, who are themselves known at that time for having just lost, just the Peloponnesian War, in which their heroic navy did not ultimately save them, and they were under the rule of the tyranny of the 30 and all of the stuff that, like, this is a moment of their own fall. And they had just murdered Socrates, and Plato really wants to rub their nose in it.
Right.
And he
Right.
tells a
And
myth.
the Athenians are perfectly capable of being bullies themselves, as we know.
They
Yeah.
were, I mean, think about what they did to the Delian League.
Yeah.
Just massacred those people.
Yeah.
And they were bullies. I mean, they were bullies to in the Peloponnesian War. They went to neutral parties and told them, we're going to murder you all if you don't side with us, and gladly did it when they didn't. And I think Plato's rubbing the Athenians' nose in the fact that they were bullies. They just got a black eye by the Spartans. They'd just been ruled by the tyranny of the 30. And when they finally did get some freedom, the first thing they do is kill Socrates. And the Republic and other kinds of texts are, I think, part of what they're doing is Plato's rubbing the Athenians' nose in that, and I think Atlantis is meant to be, this is what you get when
Right.
you're
It's an
bullies.
allegory for
Right. for
You're
them.
going to get your ass handed to you if you.
Right. And what to me is interesting is how that mythology has changed. It went from what I think of as social criticism, thinly veiled, frankly, social criticism of by Plato, to this is where all the white people came from, and they like made all of the great civilizations, and it becomes this sort of like neo-Nazi mythology that you see in, some ridiculous YouTubers videos and stuff. So to me, that's just it's to me what's most interesting about Atlantis is not whether there really was a historical Atlantis. That I think the data for that's pretty clear that there wasn't. Like islands that size just don't sink. That's not what islands do. Like
Well, there's the
islands
theory
aren't.
that something tectonic happened in with the Younger Dryas,
I mean,
water coming down from the ice sheets, blah 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 blah, and so
yeah. I mean, it would have to be if,
under the
if
earth.
Plato's descriptions of it are accurate, right? It was the size of Libya. I mean, it would have been massive.
Yeah.
I mean, it would have been the size of like Texas, like in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
Ooh, is that a cautionary tale for Texas?
Texas, yeah, nothing
So-
as big as Texas. But again, you just look at if Plato is if we're going to take Plato as accurate, we got to take Plato as accurate, and he's telling us a story that it's this size and it's beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It would need to be massive, and any tectonic event in the Atlantic, we have really good maps of the seafloor of the Atlantic. We would see remnant, we would see some archaeological evidence of something.
Why do you think this guy Donnelly, this ex-Confederate soldier, was so enamored of it, and how did he manage to get it into the public consciousness?
There's a great video if you want to learn more about this. A good friend of mine, Andy, they filmed, did a great documentary on
I'd love to.
Donnelly.
What's how did
I
he
can.
find out about? Because this guy Donnelly is not known about really. I've
He's
never
not
heard.
known about. No, this is part of this is, and again, this is part of how these mythologies get a life of their own. Is that we often don't know that the mythologies that we're telling have a history.
Did he
You
publish a
mentioned,
bestseller, 19th century
yeah, it
bestseller?
was very popular. It was a very popular book.
What was the name of the book?
Atlantis, the something something. Let me see.
Okay,
I can
Donnelly
pull it up.
Atlantis. I'll just Google it.
Yeah,
And do you know what he did in the Civil War, by any chance?
he was a soldier. Yeah,
But was
the
he an
the
officer? Was he a grunt? Was he a cavalryman? Was he
Ignatius Donnelly. What was he? He was a
Ignatius?
congressman. Yeah, you can look him up. I mean, he was kind of. I mean, but
Hmm,
he was a sort of occultist and into
hmm.
theosophy and stuff. But
Comes out,
it was published
publishes
in
book.
1882.
Okay.
But it's called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And again, as you
Hmm.
mentioned earlier about Zachariah Sitchin, right, that people don't also link back to Eric von Daniken, who's really the primordial all father of this sort of ancient alien stuff.
If you made it this far into the podcast, then I'm guessing you're somebody that, like me, loves to read books about not just how people have achieved self-actualization, but particularly about the relationship with nature, spirituality, life, the universe, and everything. And I'd like to draw your attention to my books. If you would like to read the story of how we even arrived here, perhaps you'd like to check out the two New York Times bestsellers, The Horseboy and The Long Ride Home, and come on an adventure with us and see what engendered, what started Live Free, Ride Free. And before we go back to the podcast, also check out The Healing Land, which tells the story of my years spent in the Kalahari with the Sun, Bushmen, hunter-gatherer people there, and all that they taught me and mentored me in, and all that I learned. Come on that adventure with me. Tell us about him, because again, not a lot of people know who's listening. Maybe
He wrote a book. He wrote a book called The Chariots of the Gods, and
Swiss guy, right? Swiss German.
It makes sense. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And he makes this argument, the same kind of argument that the all the old gods are in fact aliens, and again, very selectively goes and looks at the top of the burial shroud in Mayan territory and says that's a spaceship, and then sees a spaceship in this thing and sees a spaceship here and there. And again, it's the kind of thing that would be fun if it didn't lead to what I think is like real damage to the field of archaeology.
Okay. I mean, as an ex, I did archaeology and history, and I actually switched to just history because, unfortunately, the archaeology department at York University, where I went to in the UK, they were utter bastards. They really were. And I got into terrible trouble and was actually threatened with being kicked out for writing an essay, just one essay, in which I likened the Nene River Iron Age smelting culture which was a Celtic pre-Roman place where they were doing a lot of metal working along a river in England, which was they were busy excavating at the time. And I said I likened it. I made an analogy to it being like a sort of ancient world black country. Black country being the area around Birmingham where the Industrial Revolution sort of got going.
Mm-hmm.
And I got hauled in and hauled over the coals. And I remember saying, but guys, it sort of was. I'm not saying it was on the same scale, but I'm saying that if you walked along that river, you'd have seen a lot of industrial activity. There'd have been guys dumping shit in the river. There'd have been piles of slag. There would, because you found them, because you're excavating those piles of slag. Say that. And or if I say that and you think it's wrong, okay, that's fine. But why are you threatening with kicking me with being kicked out? It was really odd. And
Yeah.
I saw this time and time again among the archaeologists. And the archaeologists were also sort of a bit of an old boys club of, certainly in the UK, it was very much a sort of private boys' school thing. And I come out of that culture myself. I went to one of those schools, but I also know how protectionist they are in the same way that Oxford Dons are very protectionist and so on. And they're often, frankly wrong, about things, or at least not open to. And so the fact that one could say something as kind of innocent as that and, not be taken to task for like, well, Rupert, we just want you to qualify this essay with saying by no means on the same scale, which I would have said, yes, of course, absolutely. I will happily put that clause in there. Silly old 18-year-old me. But no, it was aggressive and it was hostile and it was strange and it was weird. And then when I transferred to do history, it wasn't much different, actually. And then it got to the point, I'm sure you've had this, where I realized I knew a bit more about certain things than some of my professors did. And then that became very uncomfortable. And you just had to keep your mouth shut. For example, I specialized in the Boer War as well as the medieval stuff. And the French Revolution. I did two modern things. The Boer War, well, my family fought on every side of the Boer War. And what I mean by that is the English and sort of non-white mercenaries in that. So we have a whole record within our family of original texts and letters and documents and this and that and blah, blah, blah. And so anyway, it didn't make me by any means anti-history, but it did make me wary of academics a bit. That said, I met some very good ones too and had some wonderful professors and so on. But I guess that thing of when I guess what I was responding to there was when you said they do the people that believe in Atlantis or ancient aliens do damage to archaeology. Do they? I mean, do they really?
And the people that believe in it don't. I think the people that popularize it on Netflix do.
But it
That's
can't
what
just view it as another mythology.
If at the very beginning they said what I'm presenting to you is a myth, that's not what they do. What they say is archaeologists are all involved in a conspiracy of silence about a civilization that existed at 10,000 BCE and seeded all the civilizations in the world.
Right.
Those are very different kinds of claims.
Mm-hmm.
It's the difference between me getting on TV and saying, a guy named Moses went up a mountain and got rules, as opposed to this is Israelite mythology. We don't have any archaeological evidence to suggest that the Exodus ever happened.
There is this naughty part of me that likes to see all the archaeologists hopping about, jumping up and down and getting upset. But that's in that interrogation room at York University. But I agree.
Yeah. I mean, and again, I also like I do think that there is, that's the right way of putting it. I do like the idea of hand grenades being thrown into dogma. And I do think that academia functions with a lot of dogma.
Mm.
But I think you combat dogma not with more dogma. You combat it with problematizing and showing that the very stories they're telling don't make sense given their own internal data. Or another way of putting this is, the way that I go about doing the work that I do is I don't do external criticism. For instance, I don't debunk anybody. I've never done a debunking video ever.
Yeah, it's true. You don't. And interestingly, I think that causes some people to mistake that maybe you are espousing or believing, even though you frequently say that you're not. But
Yeah.
Or hear what they
Uh,
hear.
and it might, and then that's fine. I'd rather take that. I'd rather risk that danger because I don't want to do. I'd rather just tell the history in its complicatedness and leave it at that, as opposed to say, well, we've told this elaborate story about Descartes and it's false, because that lets the false story lead. In the same way that I'm not going to say, well, the Anunnaki are blah 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 blah. I'm not going to like. I'm going to say, if I'm going to do an episode on the Anunnaki, I'm going to say, here are the 15 cuneiform tablets that describe the Anunnaki. Here's what the Sumerian says. This is the best data we have.
Have you
I'm
done
not going to.
episode on the Anunnaki?
No, they're not very interesting. I mean, I hate to tell people, but they're just like underworld spirits.
Okay.
They're just,
Yeah,
they're the kind like they're like it's the same reason why some people ask me like
episodes on other underworld spirits.
I haven't though. I
Have you
mean,
not?
maybe in people like I always ask people like, why are you so interested in the Anunnaki and not the Gala demons? Because the Gala demons actually have an active role,
Maybe they haven't heard of them.
and
What are
that's just that's the funny thing is that yeah, they're just underworld spirits that Demuziel and other folks have to deal with, and they're like sort of chthonic beings that seem to have existed prior to a creation, which is weird.
they? Okay.
The standard Enlil
Lovecrafty
creation.
stuff.
Yeah, Lovecraftian kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that the Gala demons are far more weird than Anunnaki. But yeah, it's like I don't do the debunking stuff because I don't want what I take to be a bad history to lead the story. I'd rather just say this is the data. And if someone says I disagree with it, I can say you can disagree with whatever you like. I don't get to control the data. All I can say is like these are the 6 tablets where the stuff is described. Here are the debates among scholars about how to read those tablets, because that's not even agreed upon. And that's to me the thing that strikes me as the most shockingly egregious about, someone like Zacharias Sitchin or something, is that the idea that he knows what they say. When Sumerian scholars are like, we're not clear even how to read some of this because we don't even totally understand Sumerian as a language.
That actually is a question. How did people decode Sumerian?
So we know, and again, I have to be careful because I'm not a Assyriologist, but we know Sumerian through Akkadian. So Akkadian is a language that we do know a lot about because it's a Semitic language like Hebrew. Like in Hebrew, if you want to say like you could say anachnu, and in an Akkadian, it's anaku. They're very similar languages.
Okay.
They're not identical, but they're similar. But we have bilingual texts in Akkadian and Sumerian. And scholars were able to decode Sumerian by reading it.
Okay.
It's like Rosetta Stones.
Got it.
Lots of them. And one of the big texts that the Akkadians produced, because Sumerian was a language a bit like Latin. It was a dead language, but it was a language they preserved as a kind of academic language. And so we have lots of basically word lists. And we have text in both languages. And so scholars were able to do this. And so they can read Sumerian with a high degree of accuracy. But the problem is that the older you go back, the less standardized the language is, the more idiosyncratic it becomes, the more they tend to use a lot more ideograms as opposed to syllabic spelling, which the syllabic spelling is a lot clearer. There's a lot less guesswork involved. And so when I hear people say like, this Sumerian tablet says this, well, that immediately jumps my hackles up where I'm like, I doubt it. I bet there's debate about what it says. And it's almost always when I read text about Atlantis or the Anunnaki or the ancient aliens, there's no debate. This is what happened.
Yeah, I think your point about replacing dogma with dogma is fair. I'm still on team cat among the pigeons. And at the same time, I'm very grateful that people like you come along and say, yeah, but listen, lads, actually, here's what we really know to date.
Yeah.
One needs both, right?
Right. And again, I feel like the more that I see, I'll give an example in my field, right? We mentioned earlier the Key of Solomon, the Clavicula Salomonis. This is the most important book of magic produced in the Western world. We know of 150 different manuscripts of it. We know that they exist. Those are the ones we know of so far. There is no standard edition of this text, and no one has ever looked at all 150. It's just, we don't even know what they all look like. We don't even know what they all say. They're not in private. Some of them are private hands. Some of them are public hands. It's a mess. When I make episodes talking about Solomonic magic, one of the things I have to remind people is this is so provisional. because in 50 years, 30 more manuscripts will be found, 15 more will be published, maybe all of them will be published. And everything I'm saying now is provisional.
Right.
And I think that's, to me,
Like the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we find a whole bunch
the
more
Nag
material.
Library and,
Yeah.
yeah, the more that I find, one of the things that makes myth interesting to me is that the mythological texts are almost always disagreeing with each other internally.
Mm.
The Bible, Sumerian text, and the text I know. If someone goes to tell you what is Norse mythology, which ones? The stories all contradict each other.
Yeah.
They're not coherent. And then when
Christianity rather than Christianity, Judaism.
Christianities, yeah, right. The myths are internally incoherent. That doesn't make them any more or less right or any more or less valuable, but it makes them authentically human because that's what human beings do.
Mm.
But when you see these new mythologies that emerge, they emerge from the same point of view and the same mindset as the Enlightenment. We have figured it all out. It's this totalitarian impulse.
Totalitarian, good word. Yes.
And in that totalitarian impulse in science, that science has figured it all out, I'm very skeptical of that. But also I see the exact same kind of impulse in the mythological world where, like, for instance, the perennialists will tell me, we figured it all out. Every religion comes from this mystical core and I'm like, huh? Like that impulse as a historian, as a scholar of this material, anyone who beats the drum of this is the answer, when I hear that drum, I know which direction to run. And
let's go to the biggest mythology of all then. You study everyone in the Western world's belief in the afterlife. What conclusions have you drawn?
In the afterlife?
Yeah. Because every mythology, every religion, every occult group that you're looking at in the Esoterica series, they all have a position on it, more or less.
Yeah. I mean, I would say they're by no means coherent.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
What have you gleaned? What rings true for you out of all the stuff that you've studied?
Oh, I don't know. I hope there is no afterlife. That's what I've gleaned. If I wake up after my death and to anything, I'm going to be pissed. I'm going to write a letter. If God forbid, I wake up and I'm in heaven and everything is perfect and I have to be there forever, that is the most miserable imaginable situation possible.
Watering potted plants. Yeah.
Yeah, just anything. Anything. If there is any afterlife at all, I'm going to be I'm going to be enraged.
Yeah, so many of these traditions that you're studying are convinced of it.
Yeah, of course.
Where does that come from? Not the desire for one. I think we can understand that, but
yeah, I think it's the human beings have the worst case of main character syndrome. Maybe that is of main character syndrome.
Ooh.
Like we built a universe that was designed for us. We're the center of it. God made us. We're made in the image of God.
But could we not be in the image of God? Could there not be? I mean, could not? Let's say there's life on 1 billion planets. Could they not all be images of God?
Maybe, but that's not the way that medieval people and other people that formulated these mythologies thought about it. They thought they were the center of everything.
Yeah,
the Earth is right there at the middle of everything, and I think that the human being can imagine almost anything, aside from there not being human beings. Like, we can imagine the end of God. We can imagine the death of God. We can imagine God being a mythology. We can imagine it all being superstition, but we can't imagine us not being around. It's the narcissistic impulse that the human being will endure forever. That death
is it narcissistic, or is it just the feature of our biology that we are in the consciousness that we're in, and that's just that. So we look through the lens we look through. We have no choice.
Yeah. But I think the idea that, like, again, I always imagine, like, when I look at different versions of the afterlife, that there are no animals there, or that there are no, like, dinosaurs there, or what about all the other life? If you get married twice and your first wife dies, what's going to happen when you get there with your new wife? She's going to be pissed. No, because
we're with God and we're beyond all that. We've now grown up and we're
then
nice to each other.
Right. And then what's the point of there being an afterlife? Because if it's so unlike what it is to be a human being that it's unrecognizable in the next one, then there's no continuity at all. Descartes even says this, like, memory has to persist through death because otherwise there's no point in an afterlife, right? Because otherwise you're just a different, there's no connection to this world. The whole point is there's continuity between the two, that somehow you survive, right? But if there's no memory, then there is no survival. If I were
Okay.
to, God forbid, hit someone on the head hard enough and completely erase their memory, they're not the same person in any meaningful sense of the term.
Right.
And so,
Let's play devil's advocate with that one. Just
yeah,
the other way. I'm just trying to think what the devil's advocate would say. What would they say? They might say, well, yes, Justin, but what if, because life comes in infinite forms of expression, there could be infinite forms of expression of life in a sort of an, of which our idea of a linear born, live, die is one expression, but perhaps could it be that in fact there's a much more complex picture there that you could transmute into other things, or the end of a physical life. I mean, the traditions that you study, talk about being a soul being embodied, and then when the body dies, the soul is still there, the spirit is still there, but whether it's still there in terms of the personality of that person or not, who knows?
I think most
What
of
do you?
them,
I mean, you study this, so you must have pondered these questions.
yeah, sure. I mean, I think that most of them imagine that, at least the Western traditions imagine that the soul becomes disentangled from the body, but the body will come back later. That's standard view in Christianity, Islam,
Okay.
and Judaism. That you get a better body later somehow, but you do get put back into a body.
Hopefully, you get an upgrade. Yeah.
Yeah, it's some glorified body or something like
Yeah.
that. I don't
Yeah.
know. But far be it for me to know exactly what all that means.
Yeah.
But if it were the case that the afterlife is somehow sufficiently unrecognizable from this life, then I simply would have no interest in it. Because if it's so different than what I understand of this life, then it will be so unpredictable about it will be on the other side that I don't have any interest in. I wouldn't have any. I mean, I wouldn't have any interest in it because
But
it would just.
you're a skeptic. You don't necessarily believe in an afterlife. Or
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I don't know that there is an afterlife.
what does Judaism say? Because you're a practicing Jew, so I'm a never having practiced Jew. So what does, given that there have been, as you say, many Judaisms in the same way that there are many Christianities, give us like 3 points historically about what Judaism says about afterlife from sort of pre-Moses, Moses-y, Jesus-y, that
Mhm.
millennium to now. What what do they say?
So the earliest Israelite literature seems to have believed in a place called Sheol, which is just sort of a dark underground place where dead people go.
Mm.
You're Yeah, you're there, but you're not very conscious. You're not really doing anything. It's a place of inactivity. God doesn't
Are
know.
you there as yourself, just kind of bored, or are
It's
you?
not even, it's not clear. I mean, the references to it are so few and so vague. Everyone goes there. It doesn't matter whether you're good or bad. Everyone
Right.
goes there.
Are you broken
Uh,
down into a sort of primordial soup and then reconfigured for later use, or
no, you've stayed forever. There's no sense of you ever come out of there. It's
okay,
just that's where everyone goes.
you sit
And it
around?
seems to be similar to Hades, the Greek Hades,
Okay,
that it's not great and not bad either. But you don't want to go there. Like no one's
but
looking
definitely
forward to
here is
going
better.
there. Here is better. Yeah. I mean, I think of that famous line in the Odyssey where or Achilles says to Odysseus, better a living dog than a dead Achilles. That he'd rather be a living dog than a dead Achilles. So I think of that. It's like no one wants to go there, but you're not
But you're
being
going to have to go
tortured.
there.
Everyone goes there. Yeah. Everyone who dies goes to a Sheol. And we're not even sure what the word Sheol means. It's a very strange word.
But it's not pleasant.
Yeah. You don't want to go there.
Okay.
Yeah.
You don't want to go there, but you're going to have to go there. It's kind of like the DV, the driving
Yeah. The
go.
DMV.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
DMV. Yeah.
Yeah. fast forward to Jesus' time, there's definitely Jews have interacted with Zoroastrians and they picked up heaven and hell.
Is that
And
where
so
we
that,
get heaven and hell from
yeah,
the
it seems,
Iranians?
yeah, it seems to be seems to be Zoroastrian influence when the Jews were in the exile in Babylon. So that seems to be where that idea comes from. And there's the idea that you go into the sky where the god lives, and you live there if you're good, and if you're bad, you go to some place and you get tortured for some period of time. Maybe forever, but maybe for some period of time.
Are the Egyptians are not saying something slightly similar as well at that time?
So the Egyptians in the New Kingdom have the belief that if you have a good soul, then you can go into the afterlife. But if you have a bad one, then your soul gets eaten by a monster called Ammit.
And
So
then
there's
what
no
happens
bad
after that?
afterlife, but there's a good one and no bad one. You just
Okay.
get destroyed. You go,
Okay.
it's oblivion. It's like good or oblivion,
Okay.
which doesn't seem that bad actually.
No, I just that's right, actually.
It's like, yeah, so that's not, you know. And then after heaven and hell, that becomes so associated with Christianity that Judaism distances itself from heaven and hell and basically quits contemplating much of it.
At what point?
Sometime in third, fourth century, it seems like Judaism drifts away from talking about the afterlife.
Fine, you guys can have heaven and hell. We didn't want
Yeah, in
to
the divorce, they got heaven and hell and exorcism and stuff. And then in the 16th century, you have reincarnation appears in the Kabbalah.
Why? Why so suddenly?
So
Where does
it
the
seems to
Kabbalah
have
even
been
come from?
the Kabbalah has a very long, complicated history going back to the 13th century, if not prior.
Hmm.
But the big idea seems to come from a guy named Isaac Luria and his student, and they developed this idea of Gilgul, which means something like to roll. And this is the idea that souls roll.
Where are they living, these two guys, these two rabbis?
So Itzhak Luria is living in Cairo. He ultimately immigrates. This is all inside of the Ottoman Empire. So he immigrates to what is now the Galilee. And Chaim Vital is living in the Galilee, and ultimately he goes to Damascus. And then reincarnation enters into Judaism as a viable.
And where do you think they picked that up from?
It's
Were
not
they
clear.
talking to Hindus? Were they talking to...
No, because there's no sense of karma, and there's no sense of you can't there's no sense of you can't go from you don't go from if you commit bad stuff in this life, you don't get sent to be a woman in the next life or made into an animal or something. You can't be reincarnated down the food chain, so to speak. But it seems to be tied up to their theory of redemption and the idea that there's a finite number of souls, and that in order for their redemption to occur, one has to make reparations for all the sins committed in one's past life.
And how does
There's
one...
a kind of so you undergo a kind of past life regression, and there's a kind of ritual expert that does the past life regression for you, a kind of Jewish shaman.
This
And they
happens
tell-
before you die. You say,
Yeah,
okay,
you figure this out before you die, and then they tell you
if it worked or not.
who were your past lives, what the major sins they committed were, and how to fix them. Chaim Vital, his and these are called soul roots. The idea that this is the root of your soul. And for instance, Chaim Vital, who was Luria's student, his soul root was Cain. He was the primordial murderer, and they're responsible for all murders, which made him, because he was, if he could
Productive.
redeem that sin, he could have been the Messiah or whatever. So you get this, and there's still people out there today in the Kabbalistic world that will do this past life regression with you.
But that's
for
similar
you.
to Buddhism, Hinduism. Then you sort of
Mhm.
get off the karmic wheel, even though you say there's no karma there. But isn't that something, a similar idea? Okay, I've expunged these sins, but you could call that karma.
Well, you do
and
it.
now I could do something else. Go
Well,
on.
you do it in order to usher in the Messiah, and so that at some point the Messianic age will be ushered in once enough sin has been expunged, and then the Messiah,
Okay.
the Messianic era will start. But it's not expected for normal
like the
people.
Rastafarian idea of chant down Babylon sort of thing. Just we put enough good stuff out there in all these ways, and the bad stuff.
The battle stuff. Yeah, and Judaism has sort of two minds about how the Messiah will come. Either it'll get so bad that only the Messiah can fix it, or it'll get so good that the Messiah will be happily welcomed into the world. That there's no medium. But in general, if you go to a local rabbi and ask them what happens to me when I die, the rabbi will tell you, "I'll let you know when I get there."
Okay, that's the predominant view now.
Right, and that's
When you're going in synagogue, they're not threatening you with hellfire and brimstone. No. Okay,
no, there's no. Yeah,
they're just
historically
saying be a mensch.
Yeah, be a mensch, and the idea is that and if you look at the Torah, the rewards are always this worldly. Follow the rules, and you'll get children, land, agriculture. Life
Right.
will be good for you.
Your barns will be bursting at the seams and your cup
Yep,
will runneth over.
runneth over, and it's like that's the kind of it's a very this worldly religion.
Okay.
And there's even a line in the Talmud that says that people who do the right thing with the expectation of reward have their reward, but that's like a child.
Mm.
It's like a toddler version of religion. That if you do the right thing to get a reward, God's like pat you on the head, good for you, but like it's a ultimately insufficient way of getting people to do the good, because then you only do the good when you get a reward, or only do the good when you get public recognition for it. And the rabbis are very skeptical of the idea that you should be rewarded in the afterlife for having done the good in this world,
Yeah,
because
it's
it
interesting.
sets up a bad idea about why you should do the good. You shouldn't do the good because you get something. You should do the good because it's a good.
This feels to me almost like a parallel with Vipassana Buddhism, or not the sort of, Buddhism of Tibetan, which is sort of like high Catholic Buddhism or whatever, but it seems, again, very similar to the kind of golden rule thing. Just, don't be a dick, because your life is worse if you are. Be a mensch,
Yeah,
because things kind of go better if you are.
yeah, I guess. I mean, I think that, Spinoza famously said that religion can be boiled down to two things, right? That that something made all this, so there's probably a God, and that whatever is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. And he thought basically religion could be boiled down to those two things, and everything else he thought of was he called superstition. He said those two things can be logically proved. The rest of it is just cultural fad and superstition. I'm not
Tell us
sure I would go
quickly who
that far.
Spinoza was, because again, not everyone knows.
And Spinoza was a 17th century rationalist philosopher famous for being excommunicated by the Jewish community.
He was living
And
in the Netherlands, right?
the Netherlands, that's right. Yeah. I've been to his house on many occasions. He's kind of one of the, I don't know if he's one of my favorite philosophers, but he's certainly a philosopher that
Why should we know about him?
I think that he pioneered the idea that one could believe in a transcendent reality without being part of a religion, that you could be secular. I mean, Spinoza was the first secular person. He was kicked out of a religion, but he never joined another one, but he didn't give up believing in something like God.
Was Descartes secular?
No, he continued to be a pious Catholic. I mean, he got in trouble with them, but I think if you'd asked him if he were a Catholic, he would say yes. He took confession, but Spinoza was excommunicated. And
So if okay, so sorry, he's saying I interrupted you for why we should know about him. Please go on.
yeah, I think that he's important because if you've ever left a religion and didn't join another one and you still believe in God, then you can thank him because he did it first.
That sort of describes me.
You
I
might
believe
have a you might have a grandfather in Spinoza.
I might, I mean, hey, I've got Dutch roots as well as everything else.
There you
Um,
go. But yeah, he also made the first protest sign that we know of in history. He
really?
ever held up a yeah after the mob murdered the DeWitt brothers, he wanted to hang a protest sign outside of his apartment saying, this is the worst barbarity. And his landlady was like, "Are you crazy? They'll tear those guys apart. They'll tear you apart. Like, don't do that."
Who were the DeWitt brothers and why were they murdered?
The DeWitt brothers were the head of the Dutch Republic and a royalist mob who wanted to restore the House of Orange, which was eventually restored, lynched them. And if you want to see a nightmare fuel painting, there's a painting made from life of what they looked like after they were lynched. And it's really horrifying. They're
Really?
emasculated, faces torn off.
Where does one find this painting?
You can Google it, I'm sure, if you just Google the murder of the DeWitt brothers.
I'm gonna and how did that play out? Because they must have had a whole power structure around them, the DeWitt brothers. I mean, how did the mob get hold of them so easily?
Yeah, I've wondered this too, and
And
I
why
can't
were
say
they
that
so enraged? Because they're sort of Dutch people, who
yeah, they're Dutch people, right? They don't have any emotions. I think that they again the politics inspires people to do bizarre, crazy things, including
yeah.
hateful, murderous things. Was Nietzsche said that insanity in individuals is rare, but insanity in crowds is the rule.
Hmm.
And so I think Nietzsche said that. It's the kind of thing Nietzsche would say. But yeah, I think that it was political tensions were pretty high, and the royalists and the Republicans were at each other's throats, and ultimately the English were able to reinstall their whatever cousins or whatever on the throne.
Ah, we were behind it. That makes sense. Yes, the Brits.
I mean, they were behind in the sense that, they definitely did not want to continue dealing with the Dutch Republic as a naval enemy, and they wanted to
Yeah.
have, and so they, I mean, that's the reason why
I found the painting.
the Ulster Royalists in Northern Ireland to this day still have orange, same way the
Yes,
House
they
of
do.
Orange. They're all connected. It's all part of the one big royal family.
I have found the painting, and trigger alert, guys.
Yeah, I don't recommend it.
I wouldn't recommend looking at it.
Yep.
Yeah, fair warning.
Yep. Yeah.
Um, not nice.
Yeah. It's but it is. That's how democracy dies. That is a painting about the death of a republic. And for all of us people who believe in rule by the people for the people, that's it's a gruesome painting, well worth contemplating. Because to me,
Right.
it's
And of course, rule by the people for the people can easily turn into oligarchies and
sure.
mafias, as we
Yep.
know.
Yep.
So there's arguments for monarchies, i.e., the devils, the mafia,
Right.
stability with that. It is the office, not the person. And changing your gangsters up every 4 to however many years. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
No. Who knows? It could be just be the case we're all shuffling the deck chairs in the Titanic. But
indeed. Indeed.
no, I like Hobbes. Hobbes says, I don't care if it's a king or a republic or a whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is the sovereignty of the people. That kings sit on their thrones as long as the people want them to.
Mm.
And then
Tell us who Hobbes was.
so another 17th century political philosopher and translator. People often they really sleep on Hobbes's translations. He did really great translations of like Thucydides and stuff. Did a translation of Homer, but he was an important political philosopher, especially a political philosopher of sovereignty.
Was he an Oxford Don? Like, how was he funding himself to
That's a good question.
do
I
these
forget
sorts of
exactly
things?
where he graduated from. He was, worked for one of these wealthy
Right. He had a
lords or
patron.
whatever. Yeah, patron. I think so. So,
And that sort of brings us to YouTube, because one of the things I find really fascinating about channels like yours, it's a big channel now. I mean, if I look at your views, it's in the hundreds of thousands, which is brilliant because, it's for me, it's revenge of the nerds because
mhm.
it vindicates people who say, "Oh, history's so boring." It's like, oh yeah. Well, look at Justin Sledge's Esoterica thing then, and look how many, because it's brilliant. Frankly, your channel is brilliant, Justin. I mean,
I appreciate that. It's very kind of you to say so.
I'd say it's beyond brilliant because it's entertaining, informative, deeply non-partisan, and fair and humorous. There's so many chuckles through the whole thing, and you've made a real success of this. I think there's a lot of people out there who just switching gears completely now. You lead a very different life now, I should imagine, to when you were an adjunct professor, to explore and study what you want to showcase what you want to sort of inform people. And it's vindicated because people are voting with their feet, with their views. So you must be making a living from this now. How did you manage to evolve that? And I watch videos of yours from 4 years ago to now, sort of thing, and it's I find it really interesting that you can present material that if I was to go to the bank and say, could you give me a loan, please, so that I can do a YouTube channel on really, really esoteric stuff that people might or might not be interested. I don't know, but I'm interested in it. And they'd probably say, Rupert, bugger off. You've made such a go of it. How?
What do you mean, how?
Well,
Just in terms
how?
of,
Yeah, because I mean, like literally, if you were to write your autobiography and say, I started here and I got here, and these were sort of the steps I took, because it must have been a real voyage of discovery for you. You didn't come out of your mother's womb knowing how to do YouTube. I mean,
yeah, no, I still don't know how to do YouTube. Still have no idea what I'm doing. You know, I, so maybe the easy way to answer it was that before I was an academic, I was in the entrepreneurial world. I was in like the tech world, and I
okay,
knew a good bit about how to start a business and how to run a business
what
and
did
how
you
to
do in the tech world out of interest?
I worked in like security, like tech
Okay,
security. And it was my brother that ultimately convinced me to do the channel. And after he convinced me, I spent 5 months planning how I wanted the channel, what I wanted to look like, what I wanted to cover, the cadence of the channel, almost all the major things. Nothing's fundamentally changed.
Mm,
I've gotten better at it.
yeah.
I found my own voice. Apparently people think that the bizarre things I say are funny, and so I don't mind, interjecting some degree of my whatever sense of humor, assuming, that I have that. But, I think that part of why the channel has grown is because of the vacuum of other reliable data. I think that when I tell people this book says this, here is the book, here is the manuscript that the book is based on, here is a link to the manuscript, you can read it yourself. Here is a thing to help you learn to read Latin so you can read the manuscript.
Right.
I don't, and also I don't tell people how history was. I say, look, this are the debates. This is the data. These are the debates over the data. Here's the data for yourself.
Yeah, but there's people out there that do that, and they're not you.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that maybe they don't do in this field. I don't know anyone else really doing that in this field. There's other people doing that in, I don't know, maybe other fields, Beowulf or something. I don't know.
Mm.
But what I think what people like is that they don't feel sold something. They don't feel told that this is the way that it is.
Okay.
I think people like saying, people like knowing that these are my sources. And also the whole channel is engineered around the idea that I'm empowering people to do the work themselves.
Mm.
People get angry sometimes when I say, well, I'm not going to summarize the book. And they're like, well, that's what I want. I want to, and I'm like, yeah, you think you want that because that feels like you're learning, but you're not learning. Wikipedia feels like learning, but it's not learning. You need to read these books. You need to study the material. And the only way to do that is by feeling like you can. And the way that you prepare people is to say, look, Sumerian's not magical. It's a language like any other language. Latin's not magical. It's a language. You can learn it. You can learn to read medieval handwriting.
And you can read in translation too.
Yeah. And here's a good translation.
Yeah.
And here's why it's a good translation. Because the translator will tell you why they make the decisions they're making.
Mm.
And it's about empowerment. And I think people often come to education and they come away from education feeling disempowered. And I want people to feel empowered. And the way you make people feel empowered is you make them feel like they can join the conversation too. And I do believe that Esoterica allows people the tools to empower themselves to enter the conversation. Now, not at a high level and not at, whatever, but it's certainly more empowering than here's some stuff I heard in a dream, or here's some stuff that like I read in a book that's not reliable, or here's my personal beliefs about this. Very rarely will you ever hear me interject my personal beliefs into an esoteric episode. Almost never.
Did you have any idea? Did you plan that it would get this big? Did you have any idea that it would, or was it more just a question of, look, I'm surprised by how big it got?
Yeah, no, I had no idea it would get this big. I'm flabbergasted every time I open up the analytics that it's this big.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's great and terrible, right? Because that means I can make a living doing it, but it also means that the amount of eyes on me are enormous, and so making mistakes becomes a much bigger deal. And also it means that, I was talking to my former teacher, Wout Hanegraaff, who at the University of Amsterdam where I was trained, and he was like, it's great that your channel's gotten this big, but just know that any mistakes you make, we have to clean up later. And that's
But
a
at
lot of
least it keeps the
responsibility.
conversation going, and at least it puts it out there in the public
Right.
consciousness. I
Right.
mean, if one was so afraid of making mistakes, one would never do anything. You should
Sure.
hear my German. It's terrible, but it's functional, and I don't mind sounding like a toddler because otherwise, how will I learn? It's. But okay, well, you said you were trained at the University of Amsterdam. What were you trained in there? Because you've
Trained in
left that bit out of your
the study
bio.
of Western esotericism. That's where I received sort of like my how to study Western esotericism, what Western esotericism is.
Did you do that as an MA
Hmm.
or MSc?
Yeah, or DC, whatever the Dutch.
And why did you go to the Netherlands?
It was the only place.
Okay. Did
That
you
was
have to
it.
self-fund that?
I got a loan. Yeah, I got a loan and I got a scholarship. So, but
Because you
yeah, it
must have
was.
come out of that in some debt.
Yeah, I think I came out with some debt, but I think it wasn't. I since paid it off, thank God. So, but yeah, it was just a task. It was. I remember finishing undergraduate and just being like, this is what I have to do. I got to go.
Why is it the only place that teaches the history of Western esotericism? Because
Like I said,
everyone's
there's not.
interested in it.
I don't know that everyone is. Some people are. I mean, I think it's the only place because there are not many people skilled enough to teach it. And there's an endowed chair. A very wealthy woman decided that she was really interested in it and decided she was going to endow a chair and
Okay.
threw millions of dollars at an institution and conjured it into being the way that rich people can do.
Yeah.
So I think it has more to do with the accident. And Wouter Hanegraaff is a Titanic scholar, is a really intellectual hero of mine. And
Why so? Tell us about him.
Wouter
Walter
has
van der
just
Graaf. It's a anagraph.
yeah, Hanegraaff. Yeah, he's
Oh,
he's just been able to shepherd the whole field in many ways by making it respectable, by publishing really great monographs and articles, by making the department a collegial place where a range of opinions are appreciated and diverse. It's a diverse field, a diverse place with lots of different people there. Yeah, he's just the Dutch. The Dutch are a practical people, and he's a practical person with an obscure interest, and he's been able to make it work. And yeah, I've always the one thing I'll say personally is that every time I've ever been around him, he listens. As a, to me as a junior scholar, as a first day in his classroom, when I said something, he listened and he interacted with me. And there was never a moment from between then and now when I interact with him where I never feel like he's like just biding his time to correct me or something. He's a real educator. He's a real scholar. He's done titanically important things for the field. And yeah, he's a real, like I said, an intellectual hero of mine. So
if you were to put into a nutshell why we ought to study Western esotericism, why should we?
it's part of our history.
Go on. There's more than that.
I think it's a part of our history that systems of power have sought to repress, that modernity has sought to repress,
Mm,
that that modern peddlers and conspiracy theories distort for their own interests. And it's had a disproportionate impact on the development of modernity.
absolutely.
And
Why
so
we think what we think. Yeah.
it's right there at the heart of it all. And I think that those are reasons why it should be taken seriously. I don't think that every religious studies department needs a Western esotericism scholar, but I do think that there's no reason why, there are not more of us out there
Mm.
as a, as a,
It's astonishing, really, that there aren't, given that Western esotericism is the belief bedrock of all our stuff.
some of it, a lot of it, yeah, it's just, but again, I can say in the United States, you have to beg, borrow, and steal to get religious studies classes,
Yeah.
just basic religious studies classes. The idea that you would have a specialization in religious studies classes is beyond the pale.
Mm. And do you think
Uh,
that just comes from dogmatic Christianity or dogmatic science-sacity, or
yeah,
somewhere in between?
scientism. Yeah, I think it's also just universities are often skeptical of. They don't want to be perceived as pushing an agenda, especially a religious agenda, and religious studies tends to be academic. I mean, we're not taking a side. We're just trying to teach religious studies, and somehow that offends people that you're not taking a position, but also taking a position isn't allowed. So it's
Yeah,
a complete catch-22.
it's so interesting. Okay,
What's
so here's the thing. Somebody needs to understand and begin somewhere. What are like the five things that somebody should start with to take them from Sumeria-ish to here to get a bit of an understanding to get going? You're talking to a 14-year-old you. Say, dude, look at these five things. What are they?
Wow, look at these five things. Well, I think there's no better place in the beginning. Look at the Keshem and the instructions of Shurupak. Those are the first two literary documents ever written.
The Keshem
Keshem and the instructions of Shurupak.
instructions of
That's
Shuruppak, and that's Sumeria.
that's Sumerian. Those are the first two literary documents ever written down that we
Yeah.
have. It's the earliest we have. I don't know if they're the first, but the earliest
Yeah.
that we've recovered. Skipping ahead, further ahead than that. God, this is like an impossible question.
Are we in Egypt? Are we in Greece?
Yeah, I think that I mean, from Egypt, I would say that the text that I would read from ancient Egypt would be the pyramid text of Unas. That's the first appearance of the soul and the afterlife in the world that we know of in literature.
Right. Unas, how do you spell it?
Unas. So
Have
that's the
all sorts of
first.
fun with that name.
Hmm?
You could have all sorts of fun with that name.
Yeah, it's either Unas or Wanis. We don't know how it was really pronounced in ancient Egyptian.
Okay.
Greece, I would say that you could spend a lifetime with Parmenides.
Parmenides, not Plato, not
Mm.
Socrates, not well.
Everything is a commentary to Parmenides. Everything is downstream of Parmenides. Everything's downstream of Plato, but Plato's downstream of Parmenides.
Okay. Didn't know that. Okay.
Parmenides.
I'm going to go have a look at Parmenides. Okay. Then I presume we hit Rome or
Yeah, or the Middle Ages. I don't know. Probably the Confessions by Augustine. That's the first time we get a person, like something like a subject. The Confessions. Everything you need to know about Christianity is Western Christianity is in the Confessions.
and that's 5th century.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Twilight of the Roman Empire.
And he's been a pagan, right?
Mhm.
Augustine. So he knows of what he rejected a bit.
Right.
Yeah.
He's a smart guy. I mean, maybe one of the smartest philosophers we've
Okay.
ever produced.
All right. And then we're at 5. Is it Spinoza?
Oh, wow. Then we have to go over the Middle Ages. Nah, it's not Spinoza. He's important, but I can't imagine he's that high on the list. God, this is like these lists are just so impossible.
Do we need to go to
Philosophical. Might be like
Bernard of
Meister.
Clairvaux, or do we need to
Yeah,
go
Meister Eckhart probably.
Meister Eckhart? Okay. Why? Why him and not Hildegard of Bingen or someone?
I mean, it's all, Hildegard is doing a very different thing. I think that Meister Eckhart brings us the closest we ever got to a kind of radical philosophical spiritual mysticism in the West.
Okay.
And he only didn't get excommunicated because he died.
Okay.
But he's, Meister Eckhart he's so important that I literally copied out an entire sermon of his by hand in calligraphy once. The sermon on hunger. I think it's such a brilliant, I copied it out just so I could meditate on it. Like letter by letter, I copied the entire thing out in Latin.
Okay.
Took me weeks. But
Okay.
again, anyone who says that I don't take this stuff seriously, and I take it so seriously that I literally will copy it out by hand in a 14th century style.
So listen, I know you have to run. Tell us how people can find you. How can they? And lads, listeners, support this dude. Go to his Patreon, buy his cool black metal merch, which I'm about to do, and listen to his show. But how do they find you, Justin, and stuff?
Yeah. And I'll apologize for the noise down below. I'm in the process of, you notice my shelves are all empty. I'm in the process of about to renovate this whole study. I only have YouTube. You can find me on YouTube at Esoterica. I have a website where people can learn a little bit more about me, but I don't have any other social media because it scares me.
Yeah.
But
if people want to consult with you, can they? If people have questions, if people wanted to engage you as some sort of a mentor or tutor and pay you to do that, can they? Or do you keep out completely back?
Yeah, it's the kind of thing where, I've done a little bit of that, but I've found it to be not a very rewarding experience because often people, time is expensive for me,
Yeah,
and
sure.
and charging people, if one person could pay me a lot of money, then that's taking time away that I could be serving lots more people.
Absolutely.
And so I've done that on a few occasions, and I'm like, yeah, I don't feel good about it because I feel like it's sort of like I feel like a medieval person where I'm bought as opposed to being able to give, and I'd rather give than be
Well,
bought.
what you do is extremely generous. And, when I'm listening to your stuff, I feel like I'm kind of wandering through the Library of Alexandria, somewhere in, Hellenic Egypt at some point, and the books are just popping out and talking to me.
No, I'm really glad. That's what any educator wants to hear, is that the past is coming to life in a rewarding way. Because, again, William Faulkner said the past isn't dead, it's not even past.
Mm.
And I think that's what I want to make clear to people, is that the past isn't dead. You're living in it.
That's very hunter-gatherer of you. It's the non-linear time thing.
Yeah.
It's past,
I guess,
present,
yeah.
future, at the same
Having
time.
not met many hunter gatherers, I can't say, but I can say that, yeah, I don't tend to think of the past as being a dead thing that influenced us.
Yeah,
It's a living thing that is influencing us,
I so
and we
agree.
should be self-conscious of that influence.
Okay, I can't recommend it enough, lads. Go listen to Esoterica, drive around, pick poo with your horses, whatever you're doing, go to the toilet, listen to it. It's brilliant. Justin, it's been fantastic to have you on. I'm your hero. I'm a fanboy. It's fantastic. I can't thank you enough for coming on.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. If you did, please help us to make more. Please like, subscribe, tell a friend, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, please go to my website, rupertisaacson.com. And if you'd like to find out about our certification courses with autism, education, horsemanship, everyday shamanism, there's a whole range of cool stuff. Putting a show together like this is not an easy task. If you'd like to support us, please consider going to our Patreon page and showing us some love there. Even the smallest donation, it really helps us to keep the good content coming. So go to rupertisaacson.com and click on the Patreon link. Not to mention our excellent merch. Please go to our shop and check out some of our really cool rock and roll themed merch, t-shirts, hoodies, all that sort of thing. rupertisaacson.com. It's all there. I can't wait for our next guest and also to meet you there. In the meantime, remember, live free, ride free.